Coulter Vance slammed the contract down on the table so hard that the oil lamp jumped. "Read it again," his lawyer said quietly. "Read the clause on line 47. Coulter read it. Then he read it a second time, his jaw tightening with each word. The Vance family ranch, 12,000 acres of Texas grassland his grandfather had carved out of nothing, the land his father had bled for, the land Coulter had spent 31 years working from before sunrise to after dark, would pass entirely to his cousin Gerald within 60 days unless Coulter fulfilled one condition buried deep in his father's estate contract. He had to be a married man, not engaged, not courting, married. And his father, apparently, had already arranged the bride. If you have ever been told that your entire future depended on a single choice you never got to make, if you have ever stood in a room and felt the walls closing in while someone else held all the cards, then you already know exactly how Coulter Vance felt that night. But here's the thing no one tells you about moments like that. The person standing across from you, the one you blame for everything, the one you have already decided is the enemy. Sometimes that person is drowning just as hard as you are. Sometimes they are fighting a war you cannot even see yet. This is the story of two people who were handed a sentence and turned it into something neither of them expected. If this kind of story speaks to you, the kind where ordinary people are pushed into impossible corners and find something extraordinary inside themselves, then stay with us. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you are watching from. We want to know how far this story travels. Now, let us go back to the beginning. The morning Evelyn Hale was told she was getting married, she was standing in a field that no longer belonged to her family. She had been up since 4, the way she always was, checking the fence line along the north pasture before the heat came. The grass was thin that year. It had been thin for 2 years running, and her father's cattle, what was left of them, moved through it like tired old men who had forgotten what full felt like. She was 26 years old, and she carried herself like someone who had long since stopped expecting the world to be fair. Her father found her at the fence post with a wire stretcher in her hands. "Evelyn." His voice had something wrong in it. She turned around and looked at him. Franklin Hale was not a man who frightened easily. He had survived a bad winter that killed half the cattle in the county. He had buried a wife and kept going. He had refinanced the homestead 3 times without ever once letting his children see him flinch. But standing at that fence line in the early morning, he looked like a man who had already lost the argument he was about to have. "There's a man coming this afternoon," he said, "a lawyer from the Vance estate." Evelyn set the wire stretcher down slowly. "What does the Vance estate want with us?" Her father looked at the ground. That was how she knew. "Daddy." Her voice went flat. "What did you do?" He had done it 3 years ago, it turned out. When the drought first hit and the creditors first came and the bank first started sending letters with language in them that made his hands shake. He had gone to Harlan Vance, Coulter's father, the old cattle baron, the man who owned more land than some counties, and he had borrowed against the only thing he had left to borrow against, his daughter's future. The arrangement was written into Harlan Vance's estate contract as a condition of a debt that Franklin could never fully repay. If Evelyn agreed to marry Coulter Vance, the debt would be cleared. The homestead would stay in the family. Her younger brothers would not grow up watching their father lose everything. "He passed 6 weeks ago," Franklin said. "Harlan Vance. And now the estate lawyers are enforcing the contract." Evelyn stood very still for a long moment. A hawk circled something in the field behind her father's shoulder. The morning was already getting hot. "You should have told me," she said. "I know. 3 years ago. You should have told me 3 years ago." "I know, Evelyn." She picked up the wire stretcher. She went back to work on the fence. Her father stood there for another minute and then walked back toward the house. And she did not watch him go because she could not afford to look at his face right now. She could not afford the things she would feel if she did. By the time the lawyer arrived that afternoon, she had made her decision. Well, the Vance ranch was not what she expected, though she could not have said exactly what she had expected. She had heard the name Vance her entire life, the way people in that part of Texas heard weather, as something large and impersonal that shaped everything around it without ever being fully knowable. The ranch spread across the southern end of the valley like something that had simply decided to be there and dared the landscape to argue. Coulter met her at the front gate. He was taller than she had pictured and harder looking. Not hard the way cruel men are hard, but hard the way men get when they have spent years doing physical work and refusing to complain about it. He had dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that was set like a door that had been nailed shut. He looked at her the way you look at something that has arrived in the wrong place. He did not offer his hand. "Miss Hale," he said. "Mr. Vance," she said. The lawyer stood between them with papers. There were two ranch hands leaning against the fence nearby, pretending not to watch. They were not pretending very well. The signing took less than 10 minutes. Evelyn wrote her name in careful, deliberate letters. Coulter wrote his like he was trying to get it over with. The lawyer shook both their hands and drove away in a cloud of dust. And then they were standing there alone in front of the gate of a ranch that was, legally, now partly hers, married to a man who had not spoken a single word to her that was not required by the ceremony. One of the ranch hands said something to the other one. She did not catch the words, but she caught the tone, and she caught the look that went with it. She had heard that tone before. She had a face for it. She filed it away. "The house is through there," Coulter said. He pointed. "Rosa handles the kitchen. She will show you where things are." "Thank you," Evelyn said. He was already walking away. "What?" Rosa was a stout Mexican woman in her 50s who had been cooking for the Vance Ranch for 18 years, and who greeted Evelyn with exactly the kind of careful neutrality that meant she was withholding judgment until she had more information. She showed Evelyn the kitchen, the pantry, the room that had been prepared. A spare room, not the main bedroom, and Evelyn understood without being told that this was an acknowledgement of what this marriage actually was. "The men eat at 6, Rosa said. "Mr. Vance eats at 6:30, separately." "How many men?" 14 at full count, 8 right now, 3 left last month when Mr. Harlan passed. 2 more left last week." "Why?" Rosa looked at her with those careful eyes. "Ranch is in trouble, Mrs. Vance. Everyone knows it. Men don't like to sign on with a sinking ship." Evelyn absorbed this. "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that stacks up," Rosa said, which was its own kind of answer. That first evening, Evelyn ate alone in the kitchen after Rosa had gone home. She could hear the ranch hands at the bunkhouse, voices and the occasional burst of laughter. She heard Coulter's boots on the floor above her at some point, and then silence. She sat with her coffee and looked at the kitchen walls and thought about the homestead she had left, and the brothers she had left, and the father she had not been able to look at without feeling something too complicated to name. She was not going to cry. She had made that decision at the fence line that morning, and she intended to keep it. She was also not going to fail. Whatever this place was, whatever this marriage was, she was here now. And Evelyn Hale had a long history of working with what she actually had instead of what she wished she had. The next 3 days were an education. She walked the property in the early mornings while the light was still low, and the air still had that brief coolness that Texas summer mornings allowed before they took it back. She walked the fence lines and the grazing sections and the dry creek bed along the eastern edge that Rosa had mentioned in passing. She talked to nobody and watched everybody. What she saw was a ranch operating on momentum and stubbornness rather than strategy. The herd was being rotated through the same 3 grazing sections on a schedule that had probably made sense 10 years ago when the grass was thicker and the water table was higher. The cattle were losing weight at a rate that anyone paying attention should have noticed months ago. The supply route to the nearest trading post ran through a stretch of road that added 6 unnecessary hours to every run, which meant the men were exhausted on supply days, and the costs were eating margins that were already razor thin. She also noticed that the water source for the north section ran dry for 2 to 3 weeks every July, and that there appeared to be an alternate creek branch running through a shallow valley about 2 miles northeast that no one seemed to be using. On the 4th morning, she went to find it. She pushed through scrub brush for an hour and a half and tore her sleeve on a thorned branch and turned her ankle slightly on loose rock and found the valley just before 10 in the morning. It was not much to look at. A narrow cut in the landscape, more shadow than space, the kind of place that required effort to reach and therefore required a reason. But the grass in it was green in a way that the main grazing sections were not, and the creek running through it was clear and steady. She stood there for a long time, doing arithmetic in her head. She made her mistake that afternoon. She went to Coulter. He was in the main barn with his foreman, a man named Dutch Garrity, working through a ledger that clearly contained news nobody wanted to hear. Evelyn knocked on the open barn door, which was a formality she knew was unnecessary, but which she observed anyway because first impressions, once set, were almost impossible to change. "Mr. Vance, I found something this morning I think you should know about." Coulter looked up from the ledger. Garrity looked up from the ledger. They had the same expression, which was the expression of men who have been interrupted and are about to be patient about it in a way that communicates how much it costs them. "There is a valley about 2 miles northeast," she said, "off the main property line, but still within your deed. I checked against the survey marker on the eastern fence. The grass there is in considerably better condition than the north section, and the water source appears reliable." Silence. "We could rotate a portion of the herd through that valley during the critical dry weeks in July," she said. "It would reduce the weight loss we are seeing in the north section cattle, which based on what I have observed is running approximately—" "Mrs. Vance," Coulter's voice was not unkind, but it was final. "I appreciate the thought, but managing the herd rotation is Garrity's department. He's been doing it for 11 years. Garrity said nothing. He had the expression of a man who was allowing someone else to handle something he could have handled harder. "I understand," Evelyn said. "I simply thought—" "We have it managed," Coulter said, and went back to the ledger. She walked out of this barn and stood in the yard for a moment in the full July heat and breathed carefully through her nose. She had known this was coming. She had known it the moment she signed her name at the gate. The question was never whether they were going to dismiss her. The question was always what she was going to do about it. She went and found Rosa in the kitchen. "Tell me about the supply runs," she said. "Who handles them? What route they take? How long they run?" Rosa looked at her for a moment. Then she poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table, and Evelyn sat across from her, and Rosa began to talk. The rustling started the second week. She heard about it before Coulter told her. She heard it from Rosa, who heard it from one of the hands, who had ridden back from the south fence looking like he had swallowed something bad. 12 head gone from the south section overnight, clean-cut fence wire, professional work. Coulter called a meeting in the main barn. Evelyn stood at the back. Nobody invited her and nobody told her to leave, which was its own kind of status. She listened to Garrity lay out what he knew and what he suspected, and she listened to the hands debate theories, and she watched the pattern of it, who talked, who listened, who looked at the floor when certain names came up. She noticed that when the name Briggs came up, Marcus Briggs, who ran the neighboring Double Star Ranch, 2 of the hands went very quiet in a way that was different from ordinary quiet. She filed it away. After the meeting broke up, she walked to the south fence herself. The wire had been replaced already, but she could see where the cut had been made and she could read the ground around the post. The cattle had not been driven out in a panic. They had been moved deliberately, which meant the people who took them had known approximately where the cattle would be and approximately when the regular night check happened. Someone had told them. She did not know yet who, but she knew where to start looking. That night she heard the argument. It was not loud. Coulter Vance was not a man who shouted, but the walls of the old ranch house were not built for privacy, and she was lying awake, and the voices carried. Another man's voice, rougher, pushing. A name she recognized, Gerald Vance, Coulter's cousin, the man who would have inherited the ranch if Coulter had not married in time. "The contract's fulfilled, but the ranch is still bleeding," Gerald's voice said. "You've got rustlers on the south section, you're losing men, and now you've got a farm wife from a failing homestead who thinks she can run cattle operations." "Gerald, I'm telling you what people are saying, Coulter. I'm telling you what they see. A man who married under pressure, holding a ranch together with rope and stubbornness while his enemies circle. Cut your losses, sell the eastern section to Briggs, and get out of my house. Coulter, I said get out. We're done tonight." Footsteps. A door. Silence. Evelyn lay in the dark room and stared at the ceiling and thought about the name Briggs. Thought about the 2 hands who went quiet. Thought about cattle moved deliberately in the night by people who knew the schedule. She thought about a man who wanted Coulter to sell land to the same neighbor she was already suspicious of. Tomorrow, she decided, she was going to start having some very careful conversations. The morning of the 10th day, she was at the well before sunrise when Garrity came past on his way to the barn. He stopped when he saw her, which she took as an opening. "Mr. Garrity," she said, "I have a question. The supply route south through Miller's Crossing, how long has that been the standard run?" He looked at her like she had asked something unexpected. 7, 8 years. Is there a reason no one uses the northern cutoff through the Perez land? Perez land is private. You'd have to negotiate access. I know Alma Perez, Evelyn said. She is the cousin of a woman who ran a dry goods store in my county. We have met twice. I believe she might be willing to discuss an access arrangement. Garrity was quiet for a moment. That route would cut 2 hours off every supply run, Evelyn said. Possibly more, depending on load. He looked at her for a long time. Not with hostility exactly, with something more like a man reassessing a calculation he had done too fast. I'll mention it to Mr. Vance, he said finally. Thank you, she said. He walked on. She watched him go. It was not a victory, it was a crack in a wall. But she had built things from cracks before. She understood, in the particular way that people understand things they have had to learn the hard way, that the work was never about grand gestures. It was about the next small thing, and the next after that, until the wall came down on its own weight. She was not going anywhere. And someone on this ranch, she was now almost certain of it, had been feeding information to Marcus Briggs for long enough that it had become routine. She was going to find out who, and she was going to do it quietly. And when she had the proof she needed, she was going to put it in front of Coulter Vance in a way he could not dismiss. She was not here to be managed. She was not here to be waited out. She was here, and she had work to do, and the people who thought otherwise were going to find that out, the slow, steady, irreversible way, the only way that ever actually lasted. The name Briggs kept turning up the way a bad smell turns up. You stop noticing it for a while, and then it comes back stronger than before. Evelyn had been at the Vance Ranch for 2 weeks when she started keeping a small notebook. Nothing elaborate. A pocket-sized thing she had brought from home, originally meant for household accounts. She repurposed it. She wrote down names, times, small observations. Which hands rode the south fence on which nights, which supply runs came back short on count, which conversations stopped when she walked into a room. She wrote in handwriting small enough that the pages looked blank from 3 feet away. She was not foolish enough to think she was invisible. She knew the hands watched her. She knew Garrity reported her movements to Coulter the way a foreman reports anything that falls outside the normal order of things. She knew the story that was circulating in the bunkhouse, that the boss had married a homestead woman for contractual reasons, and that she was now orbiting the operation like a moon that had not yet been told it had no business being there. Let them tell that story. She had work to do. The conversation with Alma Perez happened on a Tuesday. Evelyn rode out alone, which she could tell made Garrity uncomfortable, and she did not ask permission because she had calculated that asking permission for this particular errand would produce a no, and she was not interested in a no. The Perez property was 40 minutes northeast by horse, a modest spread with better grass than it looked like it should have given the drought, the kind of land that got that way because someone was paying careful attention to it. Alma Perez was a woman in her late 40s with the hands of someone who worked for a living and the eyes of someone who was deciding how much to trust you before you had finished your first sentence. She met Evelyn at the fence line. I heard Coulter Vance got himself a wife, Alma said. No warmth in it, no coldness, just a fact being acknowledged. He did, Evelyn said, though I think he'd argue the wife got him. Something shifted in Alma's face. Not quite a smile. Close to one. They talked for 40 minutes. By the end of it, Evelyn had an informal agreement, not written, not legally binding, the kind of agreement that depends entirely on both people meaning what they say, that the Vance supply runs could use the northern cutoff through Perez land 3 days a week in exchange for a modest rate that Evelyn calculated would still save the ranch more than $8 per run in time and wages. She rode back feeling the particular satisfaction of the thing accomplished by her own effort. It was a small thing. She knew it was a small thing, but small things done right had a way of adding up, and she was playing a long game that most of the people around her had not yet realized was being played. Garrity's face when she told him was extraordinary. He kept it very controlled, which was its own kind of tell. You rode out there alone, he said. I did, without telling anyone. I told Rosa I'd be back before noon. I was back before noon. He looked at her for a moment. I'll need to run it by Mr. Vance. Of course, she said. Tell him I've already spoken with Alma Perez and she's agreed in principle. The terms are in the notebook on the kitchen table if he wants to review them. She walked away before he could respond. She did not look back. She had learned early that looking back invited argument, and she was not interested in argument. She was interested in results. Coulter came to the kitchen that evening. This was unusual. He had established a pattern of eating separately and passing through spaces she occupied with the efficiency of a man who had concluded that acknowledgement led to conversation and conversation led to complication. He stood in the kitchen doorway with the notebook open in one hand. "The Perez route," he said. "Yes. Garrity says it cuts 2 hours off the supply run. Closer to 2.5 based on the distance. Possibly more if the men aren't running tired when they get back." He looked at the notebook. Then he looked at her. His expression was the expression of a man doing arithmetic he did not expect to come out the way it was coming out. "You know Alma Perez," he said. "I know of her. We'd met twice at a distance. It was enough. She's not easy to deal with. She's straightforward. That's different from difficult." He was quiet for a moment. Then he closed the notebook and set it on the table. "I'll have Garrity work out the schedule." He left. He did not say thank you. She had not expected him to. The acknowledgement was in the fact that he had come at all, and she took it for what it was and filed it alongside the other small cracks in the wall. The problem was that the wall had other things leaning against it, and some of those things were getting heavier. The rustling did not stop at 12 head. It stopped at 12 head, and then 3 weeks later it happened again. 9 head this time from the east section, a section that was supposed to be the most reliably watched. Again the wire was cut clean. Again the cattle had been moved without panic, walked out in the dark by men who knew what they were doing. Again, nobody saw anything. Evelyn had spent the weeks between the two incidents doing her quiet accounting. She had the notebook. She had the names. She had a pattern that was bothering her in the particular way that things bother you when you can see the shape of them, but not yet the proof. 2 hands. A man named Cord Hasley and a younger one, everyone called Peck, had been riding the south and east fence sections on the nights in question, both times. She did not think this was coincidence. She also did not yet know if they were actively complicit or simply convenient, paid to look the other way at the right moment, which was a different thing than being the ones who cut the wire. She needed to know which. She started with Peck. He was 22 and had been with the ranch for only 8 months, which made him the easier entry point. She found him at the water trough one morning, restringing a broke cinch strap, a job that required more patience than he appeared to have. She sat on the fence nearby and said nothing for a while, which was a technique she had found worked well with young men who were nervous around women they could not easily categorize. "You from around here?" she said eventually. "No, ma'am. Came up from Laredo." "Family down there?" "Mother, 3 sisters." "You send money home?" He looked up. "When I can." "The ranch pay well?" "It's fair." A pause. "Was fair when Mr. Harlan was running things. Things got harder after he passed?" He looked back at the cinch strap. He had stopped working on it. "Everything got harder." She let the quiet sit for another moment. "Someone's making it harder on purpose," she said. Mild, like an observation about weather. Peck's hands went still on the leather. "The nights the cattle went missing," she said. "Both nights. You were on the east section. I ride what Garrity assigns me." "I know you do. I'm not saying you cut any wire." She paused. "I'm asking if someone told you to ride a shorter loop than usual on those nights. Maybe just said something casual, like it didn't matter." The cinch strap sat untouched in his hands. His jaw was tight. "You've got family in Laredo," she said. "That's a fact I'm going to remember, and I'm going to think about it when decisions get made around here about who stays and who doesn't as things improve. That's not a threat. That's me telling you how I think." She got off the fence and walked away. She left him with the cinch strap and the silence and whatever he was going to do with both of them. He came to the kitchen door that same evening. He would not come inside. He stood on the step and spoke quietly and kept looking over his shoulder. "Cord told me the east section had a slow night. Said Garrity said to do a half loop. The third time, she saw Garrity meet a double-star hand at the property line. A brief exchange. Something passed between them. She was too far to see what. The meeting lasted less than 5 minutes, and then both men rode away in opposite directions. She wrote it in the notebook. Date, time, approximate location, description. It was still not enough. She knew that. But it was getting there. What she did not know, what she could not have predicted, was that events were about to stop giving her the luxury of time. The drought that had been pressing on the territory for 2 years chose the third week of August to make its argument in the most definitive terms available. The creek feeding the main grazing sections dropped to a trickle and then to a wet memory in the dirt. The cattle on the north and central sections began moving restlessly, pressing toward water that was not where they had been trained to expect it. 3 had died in 4 days, not from thirst exactly, more from the accumulated weight of everything that had been going wrong for too long. Coulter called a full meeting. Every hand Garrity, Rosa standing in the back because nobody told her not to. Evelyn stood near the barn door. It was the first time she had been included without having to position herself at the edges. "We rotate the north herd to the eastern section," Coulter said. "That creek's still running." "Eastern section can't hold that many head with the grass already thin," Garrity said. "We'll strip it inside 2 weeks. Then we find another option." The room was quiet. Evelyn looked at the back wall and kept her mouth still. She had been waiting for this moment for 3 weeks, and she had decided 2 days ago that she was not going to offer it in a meeting, because in a meeting it would become a debate, and in a debate it would become about who had the right to have the idea, rather than whether the idea was good. She waited until after the meeting broke up. She caught Coulter in the yard. "The valley northeast," she said. "The one I mentioned the first week." He stopped walking. "I know you looked at it before and decided against it," she said. That was not strictly true. He had never looked at it, only dismissed the suggestion. But she was giving him the diplomatic version because the diplomatic version was more likely to produce a yes. "But the water situation has changed. The creek in that valley is still running because it feeds from a different source. I checked it again yesterday." "You checked it yesterday?" "I thought we might need it." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not dismissal, exactly. Something more complicated. "It's 2 miles of rough ground," he said. "Getting the herd through that scrub? I know the path. I can ride it with whoever you send." "Evelyn, the cattle on the north section are losing weight faster than we can sell them. The valley has 6 weeks of good grazing in it, minimum. That's 6 weeks we don't currently have." He stood there in the August heat and looked at the ground, and then looked at her, and then looked at the ground again. It was the look of a man who has made a habit of carrying everything alone for so long that accepting help from an unexpected direction feels like a structural problem. "Tomorrow morning," he said finally. "First light. You show me." She was up at 4, but I was already waiting at the barn. They rode out in silence, which was the kind of silence she had gotten used to around him. Not hostile, just habitual. The silence of a man who had spent too many years in his own company to feel the obligation to fill space with words. The scrub brush was dark in the early light, the path difficult in exactly the way she had told him it would be. And she led because she knew it, and he followed because he had agreed to follow, and she appreciated the practicality of that. When they came into the valley, the light was just hitting the far grass, and the creek was running low but clear and steady, and the grass was green in the way that grass in drought country is green when it has found its water source and is holding on to it. Coulter stopped his horse and looked at it for a long time. "You found this 2 weeks ago," he said. 3 weeks now." He did not respond to that directly. He rode the length of the valley and back, checking the fence lines, looking at the water, doing the same arithmetic in his head that she had done in hers when she first found it. When he came back, his expression had shifted into something more settled. "We'll need to clear some of the brush on the north entry to get the herd through," he said. "I thought 4 men in 2 days. 3 days. All right." He looked at her. "You knew we were going to need this." "I thought we might. You checked it again yesterday to be sure." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. The creek ran. A bird called something from the scrub. "Garrity said you've been walking the property," Coulter said. "Fence lines, the creek beds, the supply routes. He said it like it was a complaint." "It probably was a complaint." "What are you looking for?" She held his gaze. "I'm looking for what's there." He watched her for another moment. Then he turned his horse toward the ranch, and she fell in beside him, and they rode back without discussing it further. But something had shifted. Not dramatically, not in any way that would announce itself, but in the specific way that things shift when 2 people who have been watching each other from a distance take a half step closer without meaning to. Back at the ranch, the shift lasted approximately 6 hours. The herd rotation to the valley was underway, Garrity directing the hands with the unhappy efficiency of a man executing a plan he hadn't endorsed when Marcus Briggs rode onto the property. Briggs was a big man, not fat, just large in the way that men who have always had enough to eat tend to be large, occupying space with the comfort of someone who has rarely been asked to justify it. He rode a good horse and wore good boots and had the face of a man who smiled easily and meant very little of it. He had brought two of his men with him. Coulter met him in the yard. Evelyn was near the barn. She did not move closer. She did not need to. "Coulter," Briggs said, swinging down from his horse with that comfortable ease. "Heard you were doing a rotation. Thought I'd come see how things were going over here." "Things are going fine," Coulter said. "Good, good." Briggs looked around the yard with the proprietary gaze of a man cataloging an acquisition. His eyes landed on Evelyn for a moment. "That her? The wife?" "Mrs. Vance," Coulter said. The formality in his voice was slight but present. Briggs smiled. "Heard she's been busy, riding the property, talking to the hands, making arrangements with neighbors." He said it in the tone of a compliment, which meant it was not a compliment. Woman with that much energy, you've got to wonder what she's looking for. "She's helping manage the ranch," Coulter said. "Is she?" Briggs looked at the valley direction. "That where you're moving the north herd through the northeast scrub?" "Yes." Briggs turned the sound into something more than acknowledgement. "Had some men near that line last week. They mentioned the creek up there. Wondered if you knew about it." He said it like he was being generous with information, like he was just a neighborly man sharing what he'd heard. Evelyn watched Coulter's face, watched the flicker of something cross it. Not quite suspicion, not quite understanding, not yet the full picture. He was a smart man. He would get there. But Briggs had been working on him for longer than she had been on this ranch, and trust built over years had a gravity that recent evidence had to work hard against. "I appreciate you coming by, Marcus," Coulter said. His voice was carefully even. "Always good to check on a neighbor." Briggs mounted his horse. He glanced at Evelyn one more time, and this time the smile he gave her was a different kind. The kind that acknowledged she had been watching him and wanted her to know he had noticed. "Mrs. Vance, hope you're settling in all right." "Quite well," she said. "Thank you for asking." He rode out with his two men, and the yard was quiet for a moment, and then the hands went back to work. That evening, Coulter came to the kitchen. He stood at the table instead of sitting. He had the look of a man who was about to say something he had been arguing with himself about. "Briggs knew about the Northeast Creek before I did," he said. "Yes." "That bothers me." "It should." He looked at her. "You know something." "I have some observations," she said carefully. "I don't have proof of everything I suspect." "Tell me the observations." She brought out the notebook. She did not hand it to him immediately. She opened it to the relevant pages and walked him through it methodically, the way she would have walked through ranch accounts, giving him the facts without the interpretations first, so that the interpretations would feel like conclusions he had reached rather than arguments she was making. The fence loop conversations, Garrity's evening rides, the timing. Coulter listened without interrupting, which was something she appreciated about him even now. He was a man who heard things out. When she finished, the silence in the kitchen was heavier than usual. "Garrity's been with this ranch 11 years, he said. "I know. That's a long time for a man to turn on you. It's also a long time to be passed over, or underpaid, or to watch a neighboring operation do better than the one you work for and start doing the math." Coulter was quiet. "I'm not telling you it's definitely Garrity," she said. "I'm telling you what I saw and when I saw it. What you do with it is your decision." He picked up the notebook and looked at the pages again. His jaw worked. "He came to you first," he said. It was not quite a question. "About the Perez route. You told him before you told me." "I told him the morning I got back from the Perez property. I thought it would go to you through him. I realize now that was a mistake." "Why a mistake?" "Because he sat on it for 3 days before telling you. The route had been available for 3 days and he chose not to present it." Coulter set the notebook down. "I need you to do something," Evelyn said, "and I need you to trust me about the way we do it." He looked at her with those dark eyes that she still could not entirely read. "What?" "I need you to tell Garrity we're moving the south herd to the western section on Friday night, and I need that to be a lie." The silence stretched. "If someone passes that information to Briggs," she said, "and something happens to the south section on Friday night, we'll know the pathway." Coulter's expression was that of a man standing at the edge of something he had been refusing to acknowledge for longer than he should have. "And if nothing happens," he said, "then I'm wrong about the pathway, and we find another explanation. But I don't think I'm wrong." He picked up his hat from the table. He looked at the notebook one more time. When he walked out of the kitchen, he did not say yes, but he did not say no either, and she had learned enough about Coulter Vance in the past weeks to understand that the absence of no from a man like him was its own kind of answer. Friday came, and the South Section cattle stayed exactly where they were, and the lie was told, and Evelyn sat up in the dark kitchen waiting with a patience that had a hard edge to it. Now, a patience that was not peaceful, but purposeful. The kind of waiting you do when you already know something and are simply watching the world catch up to you. 3 things happened in the hour before midnight. A horse left the barn. She heard it. One horse, moving quiet, heading south. 30 minutes later, she heard riders on the South Section. More than one. Moving deliberately. And then, from the direction of the south fence came the sound that unmade everything. A dry crack, then a low roar, and then orange light climbing the night sky. Not cattle, not fence wire. The south barn was burning. She was out the door and running before the shouts started, and behind her the ranch house door slammed open and Coulter came out with his boots half on and his voice cutting across the yard, and the hands came pouring out of the bunkhouse. And the fire. It was bad. She could see that immediately. The old dry wood of the south barn was taking the fire the way a dry summer takes a match. Not reluctantly, but eagerly, with everything it had. They lost the barn. They lost the equipment inside it. They lost 4 horses that could not be gotten out in time, and she would hear about those horses in her sleep for a long time afterward, the sound of them. They saved the adjacent corral and the hay store by sheer desperate effort and the absence of wind, and when the fire finally gutted itself around 2 in the morning, everyone stood in the smoky dark looking at what was left. Garrity had been among the first hands on the scene. He had worked the water line with everyone else, and she had watched him do it, and there was nothing in his face she could read one way or the other, which was its own information. In the morning, she found Peck by the water trough again. His face was hollow with something, guilt or fear, or the particular exhaustion of someone who had been unable to sleep for reasons that were not about the fire. "Who told Cord we were moving the south herd?" she said. She did not ask it like a question. She said it like a fact she was confirming. Peck's throat worked. Was it Garrity, or was it Cord on his own? "Garrity," Peck said. His voice was barely above a sound. "Cord told me last night, before the fire. He told me Garrity passed it to one of Briggs's men on Wednesday. He told me like he thought I already knew. Does Cord want to keep his job? I think he wants to not go to jail. Then both of you need to be willing to say what you know, when the time comes." She went to find Coulter. He was standing in the ash and debris of the south barn, alone, looking at what the night had done. His back was to her. His shoulders had the particular set of a man who has absorbed something that would have knocked a different person down. She walked up and stood beside him. They looked at the ruined barn together. "I'm sorry," she said. "About the horses." He did not respond immediately. The ash was still warm underfoot. The smell of it was everywhere. "Peck will talk," she said. "He told me Garrity passed the information about the south section to one of Briggs's men on Wednesday. Cord Hasley can confirm it." Coulter was very still. "Garrity ordered Peck to ride short loops on the nights the cattle went missing," she said. "Both nights, the same pattern both times." Still nothing from him. "I know this is a hard thing," she said. 11 years is a long time to trust someone. It's not about the years." His voice was rough. "I stood with that man at my father's funeral. He was there." She did not say anything to that. There was nothing useful to say. "You knew before the fire," he said. "You suspected." "I suspected the pathway. I didn't know Briggs would burn the barn. I thought we'd catch wire cutting." He turned and looked at her. His eyes were red-rimmed, from smoke, from the sleepless night, possibly from other things. "I dismissed you," he said. "The valley. The first week you were here. You had it right, and I dismissed it." "You didn't know me." "I know you now." The ash settled between them. Somewhere across the property, a horse moved in the surviving corral. The morning was hot already and getting hotter. "What do you want to do about Garrity?" she said. "I want to end it," he said, "properly, with proof that holds up." "Then we need to move carefully. If we take this to the county sheriff without the right backing, Briggs's lawyers will dissolve it. He has money and he has connections, and he will use both. What do you suggest? She had been thinking about this since 2 in the morning, standing in the smoke watching the barn burn. There's a cattle association meeting in 3 weeks in Harker's Junction, she said. 3 of the ranches Briggs has been pressuring are going to be there. If Briggs is burning barns and running rustlers, he's not only doing it to us, he's doing it to anyone who might compete with him. Coulter looked at her. We build a case, she said. Not just for ourselves, for all of them. We bring it to the association together, with documentation, with witnesses. Briggs is large, but he's not large enough to absorb a coordinated complaint from half the territory's ranchers. Coulter was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the ash cooled slowly in the August morning. The loss of the barn sat between them like a physical thing. Dollars, horses, time, the kind of blow that did not unhappen just because you understood why it had happened. How long? He said. 3 weeks to the meeting. 2 to build the documentation. He looked at the ruin of the barn one more time. Then he looked at her. All right, he said. It was a small word for a large decision, but she had come to understand that about Coulter Vance. When he committed to something, he committed to it completely and without fanfare, the way someone does when they are not performing resolution but actually feeling it. She turned back toward the ranch house, already thinking through the next 2 weeks. Who to contact, in what order, what to document, how to build the kind of case that holds. Behind her, she could feel Coulter still standing in the ash, and she did not hurry him out of it because some things had to be stood in for a while before you could leave them. The work was not done. It was in a way that she had not fully anticipated, just beginning. But for the first time since she had signed her name at the gate of this ranch, she did not feel like she was doing it alone, and that was a thing she had not known she needed until she had it. The 2 weeks before the association meeting were the hardest kind of work, the kind that does not show on your hands at the end of the day, but sits behind your eyes and follows you into sleep. Evelyn started with the documentation. She went back through everything in the notebook and rebuilt it into something cleaner, more organized, the kind of record that a man with a legal background would find credible rather than dismissible. She cross-referenced dates against the ranch ledger, against Rosa's kitchen log. Rosa kept a meticulous record of provisions and supply run returns that turned out to be surprisingly useful as a timeline anchor, and against 2 other sources she had not expected to find useful until they were. One of those sources was Peck. He had made his decision the morning after the fire, apparently, and he had made it in the particular way that young men make decisions when they have been scared enough, completely, without negotiating. He sat at the kitchen table and told Evelyn everything he could remember in the order he could remember it, and she wrote it down and asked him to read it back and correct what was wrong. And he did. Cord Hasley was harder. Cord was older and warier and had more to lose and knew it. He came on the second day, not because he was brave, but because Peck had told him what Evelyn had said about the difference between information and testimony. And Cord had apparently spent a night calculating which side of that line was safer to be on. The other source was Rosa. Rosa had seen Garrity's evening rides for months. She had not known what they meant, but she had a memory like a ledger herself. Dates, times, the kind of detail that accumulates in a person who has spent years paying attention to a household's rhythms. She gave Evelyn 3 additional dates that matched perfectly with movements in the Double Star's cattle inventory that Evelyn cross-referenced from the trading post records in town. She had ridden to town herself for those records, telling the trading post clerk she was updating the ranch's accounts, which was not entirely a lie. The trading post clerk, a thin man named Aubrey who had clearly been expecting a different kind of new Mrs. Vance, had been so surprised by the specificity of her questions that he had answered them without thinking to wonder why she was asking. By the end of the first week, she had a document that ran to 11 pages in her careful handwriting. She showed it to Coulter on a Sunday evening. He read it twice without speaking. When he set it down, his expression had the quality of a man who has been looking at a picture from close range for a long time and has finally stepped back far enough to see what it is. "This is enough for the association," he said. "It should be. The question is whether the other ranchers have their own pieces of it. Tom Aldridge will." Coulter was already thinking forward. She could see it. His east section borders Double Star. He's lost cattle twice this year and couldn't prove anything. Jesse Fitch over at the Bar K had a supply contract canceled last spring. The buyer pulled out, and 6 months later that buyer was doing business exclusively with Briggs. That's a pattern. That's a very deliberate pattern. He looked at the document again. I need to ride out and talk to them before the meeting. I need them to come in with their own information, not just backing mine. I was thinking the same thing. If it looks like only the Vance Ranch has a grievance, Briggs will argue personal conflict. If 3 or 4 ranches show the same pattern, it becomes systemic. He nodded once. I'll go tomorrow. I'll come with you. He looked at her across the table. It was a look she was getting better at reading, not the dismissal of the early weeks, but something more complicated, a man recalibrating a habitual response against new information. All right, he said. The word still surprised her when it came easily. She filed that away too. They rode out the next morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that, and by the end of 3 days they had spoken with Tom Aldridge, Jesse Fitch, and a woman named Carla Benton, who ran the Sunrise Spread to the northwest, and who had the sharpest mind and the least patience for pleasantry of anyone Evelyn had met in the territory. Carla Benton had been fighting Briggs's encroachments for 2 years without making any headway, mostly because she had been fighting alone. She sat in her kitchen and read through Evelyn's documentation with the focused attention of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this. I've got purchase records, Carla said. Briggs has been buying up water rights, not land, just the water. 4 creek sources in this valley system. He's been doing it quiet, through a land agent in Harker's Junction, using different names on each transaction. Legal names, Coulter said. Legal enough that it's hard to challenge. But if he controls the water and the territory dries out the way it's been drying, he controls who survives and who doesn't. She looked at Evelyn. You knew about this? I suspected there was a water strategy. I didn't have the specifics. I do. Carla tapped the folder on her table. I've been building this for 8 months. I just didn't have enough pieces until now. The 3 of them sat in Carla Benton's kitchen and built the combined case together. And by the time they left, Evelyn felt the particular momentum of things that have been going in one direction for too long finally starting to turn. She should have known, by then, that turning things around cost something first. The cost came 3 days before the association meeting, in a way she had not anticipated and could not have entirely prevented, though she would spend a long time afterward wondering if she could have. Garrity found out. She did not know how. A word dropped somewhere, a hand who had seen too much and talked too freely, or simply the intuition of a man who had survived 11 years in a suspicious environment by trusting the feeling when something was moving against him. But on a Wednesday evening 2 days before they were due to ride to Harker's Junction, Garrity went to Coulter. She was in the kitchen when the conversation happened in the main room, and she did not move to listen at the door because she did not need to. The walls were thin, and Garrity's voice, when he dropped the careful foreman's register and let the real thing come through, was not quiet. I know what she's been building, Garrity said. I know about the document. I know you've been writing to the other ranches. I want to tell you my side of it before you go to that meeting and make a mistake you can't take back. Then tell me, Coulter said. I was protecting this ranch. The words had a practiced quality, like a speech that had been rehearsed but not quite enough. Briggs had enough on us. The debt from the drought year, the lost contracts, the rustling problems, that if I hadn't given him small things to keep him satisfied, he would have moved on us directly. I was buying time. Buying time, Coulter repeated. Feeding him information about our operations kept him from doing anything more drastic. The alternative was a full assault. Buyers pulled, credit denied, political pressure. I've seen him do it. I've seen him destroy 3 operations in this territory. I was managing the threat. The silence that followed was long enough that Evelyn set down the cup she was holding. Managing, Coulter said finally. Yes. The south barn burned down, Dutch. I didn't know he was going to do that. And there was something in Garrity's voice when he said it that might have been genuine. The specific register of a man who had misjudged the thing he thought he was controlling. I passed information about a herd move. I didn't tell him to burn anything. You told him where we'd be and when. What he did with that is on your head the same as his. Coulter. And the horses. Coulter's voice was very steady. 4 horses, Dutch. You grew up around those horses. My father bought 2 of them. The silence this time was different. She heard Garrity make a sound that was not quite words. I'm going to need your resignation in the morning, Coulter said. Signed, with a statement about what you passed to Briggs and when. If you give me that, I'll use it at the meeting and I won't pursue the rest with the sheriff. If you don't give it to me, I will pursue everything and you can explain your side to a judge. Another silence. That's not, Garrity started. It's more than fair, and you know it. You've got tonight to think about it. She heard Garrity's boots on the floor. The front door opened and closed. She sat in the kitchen and breathed and thought about 4 horses in 11 years and the specific way trust collapses when you find out it was never what you thought it was. Coulter came into the kitchen. He sat down across from her. He looked tired in a deep way, the kind of tired that sleep does not entirely fix. "He'll sign it," he said. Not a prediction exactly, more like something he needed to believe. "I think so too," she said. He looked at his hands on the table. They were good hands, worked, calloused, the hands of a man who had spent his life doing the actual labor of the thing he owned rather than simply owning it. She had noticed his hands before. She noticed a lot of things she did not particularly plan to notice. "I hired him," Coulter said. 2 years after my father hired him, I renewed his contract myself. I looked at his work, and I decided he was worth keeping. "You hired a foreman," she said. "Not a saint. Nobody hires a saint." His mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile. "What he said about protecting the ranch," she said carefully. "He wasn't entirely wrong about Briggs's capabilities. He misjudged the method badly, but the threat he was trying to manage was real. You're defending him." "I'm being accurate. There's a difference." She paused. "He made a bad choice for a complicated reason. That doesn't make the consequences any less real. But it means what you offered him is right. The signed statement in exchange for not pursuing it further. Take the tool he can give you and use it." Coulter looked at her across the table. "You think like a strategist," he said. It was not said with admiration exactly, more with the quality of a man noticing something that keeps surprising him. "I think like someone who grew up with not enough," she said. "You can't afford to waste usable things." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "My father arranged this marriage." "I know. I resented it, before I met you and then for a while after." "I know that too. I was wrong to be as—" He stopped. He was not a man who found apology easy. She could see the shape of it, the way he was looking for a word that was honest without being theatrical. "I should have taken you more seriously from the start." "You took me seriously when the evidence earned it," she said. "That's not unreasonable. That's just a standard. It's a higher standard than I apply to men." She held his gaze. "Yes," she said. "It is." He absorbed that without deflecting it, which she appreciated more than she could easily say. Garrity's signed statement was on the kitchen table by 7 the next morning. She read it before Coulter came down. It was not a confession in the legal sense. It was careful, the way a man writes when he is trying to limit damage while still complying. But it named dates and named Briggs and described 3 specific information exchanges in enough detail that it corroborated everything else she had documented. She put it with the other papers. They rode to Harker's Junction the following morning. Coulter, Evelyn, Tom Aldridge, Jesse Fitch, and Carla Benton, who brought her own folder of water rights documentation and had a look on her face that suggested she had been waiting for this particular morning for 2 years. The association meeting was held in the long room at the back of the Harker's Junction Grain Exchange, a building that smelled of old wood and dust and the specific stuffiness of a space that only gets full ventilation 4 times a year. 14 ranchers were present. Marcus Briggs was among them, seated near the front with the comfortable posture of a man who owned the room he was sitting in, which in several senses he did. He saw Evelyn come in behind Coulter, and his expression did something careful and quick that she caught and filed. The meeting's ordinary business ran for 40 minutes. She sat and listened and said nothing, watching the room. Watching who deferred to Briggs when something went to an informal vote. Watching who sat with arms crossed. Watching the geometry of alliances that the seating arrangement revealed to anyone paying the right kind of attention. When the ordinary business was concluded, Coulter stood up. "I have a matter for the association's consideration," he said. Briggs shifted his weight, just slightly. Coulter laid it out methodically and without drama, which was the right instinct. Drama invites counter-performance, while methodical presentation invites the room to follow your logic and arrive at its own conclusions. He covered the rustling, the fire, Garrity's signed statement. He covered the dates and the pattern. He covered Briggs's practice of using intermediaries to pressure buyers and deny credit to competing operations. Then Carla Benton stood up and laid out the water rights acquisitions. Then Tom Aldridge described his missing cattle and the specific dates. Then Jesse Fitch described the canceled supply contract and the buyer who had ended up exclusively with Double Star within a year. The room was very quiet by the time Jesse Fitch sat down. Briggs had not moved. He had the stillness of a man containing something at significant effort. When he spoke, his voice was controlled and his smile was present, and he used the word accusations 3 times in his first 2 sentences. "These are serious claims from people who have obvious business grievances," he said. "A signed statement from a foreman who was fired, who clearly has reasons to make his employer look better than himself, is not documentation. It's a grievance wrapped in handwriting." "Garrity wasn't fired," Coulter said. "He resigned. The distinction matters because a resignation doesn't come with liability protection, and he knew it when he signed." "Carla's water rights are public record," one of the ranchers near the back said. "A man named Hollis, who ran the river-adjacent property and who Evelyn had noticed sitting with arms crossed from the start. I can verify the purchase chain myself. 3 of those creek sources feed into my northern boundary." "Mine too," said another voice. Briggs looked at the room. He was recalculating. She could see it, the same way she had watched him recalculate in the yard of the Vance Ranch when he had come to assess things, and found her watching him back. He was a man who was very good at controlling situations, one person at a time, and significantly less comfortable when the situation involved a room that had made up its mind. "This association was built on cooperation," he said, "not on one rancher's wife playing detective and dragging personal disputes into a professional forum." The room went a different kind of quiet. Coulter turned his head slightly in Briggs's direction. "Say that again," he said. "I meant no disrespect to Mrs. Vance." "You meant exactly that," Carla Benton said from across the room. And there was something in her voice that shut the space down completely. Carla Benton was 61 years old and had outlasted 2 husbands and a bank, and she had the voice of a woman who was done being patient with a particular category of person. "And every man in this room knows it. Now sit down and let the association vote." The vote went the way it went, not unanimously. Briggs had allies, men whose operations were adjacent to his power and who calculated that staying close was safer than standing with a majority that might not hold. But 12 of the 14 ranchers voted to refer the documentation to the county sheriff and the territorial land office, and to collectively suspend business dealings with Double Star pending the outcome of the referral. It was not a verdict. It was not a hammer blow. But it was the kind of coordinated pressure that a single large operation could not absorb without consequences, and Briggs knew it when he walked out of that room with 2 allies and 12 people's backs to him. She watched him go. He did not look at her on the way out. The ride back to the ranch was different from the rides before it. The air had the quality of a day that has resolved something it had been building toward for a while. Coulter rode beside her rather than slightly ahead, which was a small thing that she noticed. "He'll come back at us," he said. "I know. Not the same way. He's too smart for the same way twice." Then we watch for a different way." He was quiet for a moment. "You were steady in there." "I wasn't steady on the inside." "You looked it." "That's the goal," she said. Something moved in his face. A small thing, but there. She looked back at the road. What she did not tell him was that her hands had been shaking under the table at the grain exchange for the first 30 minutes, and that she had spent the entire ride to Harker's Junction running through every argument Briggs might use and every weakness in their documentation and every possible way the room could go wrong. She had been terrified in the specific way that capable people get terrified, not of failing, but of failing publicly, of being the reason something good came apart. She had held it. She held most things. But she was getting tired, and she knew it, and she was careful not to let that show either. The week after the association meeting brought its own complications, because resolution in the real world is rarely the thing that arrives clean and complete. Briggs's lawyer appeared in town. The county sheriff sent a deputy to take statements, a young deputy who was clearly not sure what he had walked into, and who wrote everything down with the careful attention of someone who planned to hand it to someone more senior as quickly as possible. 2 of the ranchers who had voted with them sent word that Briggs had approached them privately and offered favorable water access in exchange for withdrawing their support. One of them wavered. The other told Coulter directly and offered to document the approach. Evelyn added it to the file, which at this point had grown to something that required its own saddlebag. What she had not anticipated, what she genuinely had not built into her calculations, was the drought hitting its final and worst phase at the same moment all of this was demanding attention. In the last week of August, the valley's main water source dropped to less than a foot of water over rock. The Northeast Valley Creek, her creek, she had started thinking of it, which was a small vanity she allowed herself, was still running, but it could not sustain the full herd. They were managing, but managing at the edge, and the edge was getting sharper. And then Tom Aldridge sent a rider with a message that changed the calculation entirely. The market at Hartwell, a town she had never visited, 60 miles east through some of the most difficult terrain in the territory, had an unexpected shortage. A major cattle supplier had defaulted on a delivery contract. The Hartwell buyers were offering a premium rate for whatever they could get before the 1st of October. She read the message twice. Then she found Coulter in the main barn. "Have you seen this?" He read it. His face went through several things in quick succession. 60 miles, he said. To Hartwell. Yes. Through the canyon country. Yes. In September, with a depleted herd that's already been pushed by drought stress. Yes. He set the message down on the hay bale beside him. He looked at her. "The water situation is not going to improve before October," she said. "Even if Briggs's legal situation breaks in our favor next month, the creek levels are what they are. We're feeding a herd on a valley that was meant as a temporary solution. And the Hartwell rate is..." She paused. "It covers the barn, it covers the drought losses, it probably covers the legal costs, and it gets us to October with enough left to rebuild properly. And if we lose cattle on the drive, canyon country in late summer, flash floods, rough terrain, the herd already stressed, then we lose cattle on the drive instead of losing them here slowly over 2 months with no return." He picked the message up again. She watched him do the arithmetic, the same arithmetic she had done, arriving at the same uncomfortable answer. 60 miles, he said again. It was not quite an objection now, more like a man measuring something out loud. "I've been looking at maps," she said. "There's a northern route that avoids the worst of the canyon narrows. It adds 8 miles, but it reduces the flash flood risk significantly. And there are 2 water sources along the way that are fed from the mountain runoff rather than the valley system, so they should still be running." He looked at her. "You've been looking at maps since this morning. Aldridge's rider only arrived 2 hours ago. I read fast." He almost laughed. She saw the edge of it, the way it pressed at the corners of his mouth and then held, because he was a man who had not laughed easily in a long time, and the muscle for it was a little stiff. "Tell me the northern route," he said. She told him. He listened, asked 3 specific questions about terrain features, and listened to her answers. She had the right answers because she had anticipated the right questions, and this was the kind of thing that had been true between them for weeks now. The specific rhythm where he pushed, and she had already been there, and the push became a conversation instead of a challenge. "How many men do we need for a drive like this?" "Minimum 8. We have 6 who I trust, Peck included." Peck. He made his choice. He'll work for it. Coulter considered. "We can ask Aldridge if he can spare 2 hands for a week. He owes us something after the association meeting." "That's what I was thinking." They looked at each other across the barn in the hot, late August afternoon. "You know what people will say," he said, "about the route, about the drive, about a woman pushing a starving herd through canyon country when any reasonable person would wait out the drought. People have been saying things about me since the day I arrived," she said. "I've been filing it away." "And?" "And the file doesn't change the water levels." He picked up his hat from the fence rail. "I'll write to Aldridge tonight. I'll start the supply inventory in the morning. Evelyn." He said it in a way that made her stop before she got to the barn door. She turned. I was standing in the dusty afternoon light with his hat in his hand, and he had the look of a man who is deciding how much to say. "This drive," he said. "If it goes wrong..." "It's going to go wrong in places," she said. "Things this hard always go wrong in places. The question is whether we can manage what goes wrong well enough to get to the end of it." He held her gaze. "Can we?" She thought about the fence line at her father's homestead. She thought about signing her name at the gate of a ranch where she was nobody and knowing she was not going anywhere. She thought about the valley creek she had found alone in the scrub brush with a torn sleeve and a turned ankle, and the barn fire, and the grain exchange meeting, and Carla Benton's voice shutting the room down. "Yes," she said. "We can." She left him in the barn and went to start the supply inventory, because that was what came next, and she had learned a long time ago that certainty, the working kind, was not about feeling sure. It was about doing the next thing anyway. Outside, the August sky was deepening toward evening, cloudless and wide. And across the southern range, the herd moved in that slow, restless way. Cattle move when the water is wrong and the ground is dry, and they do not know yet that something is coming. In 3 days, they would begin to know. In 3 days, the drive would start. And whatever was going to go wrong would start going wrong. And she would handle it the way she handled everything. With the notebook, with the arithmetic, with the particular stubbornness of a woman who had been underestimated by enough people for long enough that she had stopped being surprised by it and started being ready for what came after. The drive started on a Tuesday, which Evelyn would later think was appropriate. Not a Monday, which carried the weight of fresh beginnings, and not a weekend when people did things with ceremony. Tuesday was a working day. It asked nothing of you except that you show up and do the next thing. They moved the herd out before sunrise. 231 head, what remained of the Vance cattle after the drought losses and the rustling and the slow attrition of a hard summer. They were thin in the way that animals get thin when they have been conserving energy for too long. Functional, still, but with a watchfulness in their movement that told anyone who knew cattle that they were operating close to their margins. Coulter knew it. She knew it. The hands knew it. Nobody said it out loud because saying it would not change it, and there were 68 miles of mixed terrain between them and Hartwell, and the first water source was 14 miles north. Tom Aldridge had sent 2 men, brothers named Walt and Cyrus, both in their 30s, both capable in the specific way of men who have done this work so long it has gone from skill into instinct. They fell in alongside Peck and the 5 remaining Vance hands with the ease of people who understood that on a cattle drive, the past arrangements and internal politics of where you worked did not matter as much as whether the man riding beside you was going to be there when something went wrong. Something went wrong on the second day. It went wrong in a way that was not dramatic. No storm, no attack, nothing that announced itself. That Evelyn had traced on the maps ran through a section of high scrub that the maps had shown as passable. What the maps had not shown, because maps made 3 years ago do not account for a season of unusual erosion, was that the trail through that section had been cut through in 2 places by gully wash. Not impassable for horses, problematic for cattle, already moving with the nervous energy of animals who did not want to be moving at all. Coulter stopped at the first gully and looked at it, and then looked at her. "How wide?" she said. 8 feet, maybe, 4 feet deep at the center. We can fill it enough to drive them through if we have the time. We have the time if we stop here. We lose the afternoon. She thought about the water source 14 miles north. She thought about the herd's condition. She thought about the second gully, which she had not seen yet, and which might be worse. "Fill it," she said. They lost the afternoon. Every man worked, digging, piling rock and loose dirt, building a rough crossing that would hold long enough for 231 cattle to walk over it one at a time. The second gully was narrower, and they managed it faster. By the time they made camp that night, they were 7 miles short of where they needed to be, and the water in the supply barrels was running lower than she had planned for because the day's heat had been worse than expected, and the men had needed more than she had accounted for. She sat with the supply numbers after the camp was quiet and did the arithmetic 3 times because she did not want the answer she was getting. The first water source was still 7 miles out. They would reach it tomorrow afternoon if the terrain cooperated. If it did not cooperate, or if the source was lower than expected, they were going to have a problem. She wrote it in the notebook and then looked at the dark for a while and then lay down and slept for 4 hours because 4 hours was what the schedule allowed. Coulter was awake when she woke. She found him at the edge of camp looking north. 7 miles, he said without turning. 7 miles, she confirmed. Herd's holding. For now. She stood beside him. The pre-dawn dark had that specific quality it gets in dry country. A clarity, an openness, like the air itself has decided to be honest about how much space there is between you and everything else. Walt said the 2 lead steers are steady. If they stay steady, the rest follows. Walt knows what he's talking about. He does, she paused. I underestimated the water consumption yesterday. The heat. He looked at her sideways. By how much? Enough to notice, not enough to be critical yet. If we reach the water source today, we're fine. And if we don't? Then we ration this evening and we reach it tomorrow, and we're not fine, but we're manageable. He turned back to the north. I want to push the pace this morning, before the heat. That's what I was going to suggest. They broke camp before the light fully arrived, moving a herd fast enough to cover ground but slow enough not to push stressed cattle into a panic was an art that required constant attention and constant communication between riders. And she had positioned herself on the eastern flank where the terrain was most likely to produce trouble. She was not the most experienced rider in the group, she knew that and did not pretend otherwise. But she was the one who had studied the route most carefully, and she knew where the hard moments were coming before they arrived. The morning went well. That was the other thing about difficult endeavors. They were not continuously terrible. There were stretches of terrible and stretches of ordinary, and even brief stretches of something that resembled good, and you had to take the good stretches as fuel rather than conclusion because they would end, and you needed to have stored what they gave you. The water source appeared at 2 in the afternoon, a running creek fed from higher ground, clear and steady, and cold enough that the lead steers went in without hesitation, and the rest followed with the enthusiasm of animals who had been patient for longer than patience felt natural. She sat on her horse at the edge of the creek and watched 231 cattle drink and felt something loosen in her chest that she had not realized was tight. Peck rode up beside her. "That's a good sight," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." He had been reliable on the drive in the way that people are sometimes reliable when they have decided they owe a debt and are paying it back through behavior rather than words. She had not told him she noticed. She did not need to. They camped at the creek for the night and resumed the next morning, and the next 2 days were hard but navigable in the way that things are navigable when the critical uncertainty has been resolved and what remains is simply work. The terrain through the midsection of the route was rough but not treacherous. They lost 2 head to a canyon-edge stumble on the 4th day. The ground gave way without warning on the eastern trail, and 2 steers went before anyone could redirect them, and she watched it happen from 40 yards away, and there was nothing to be done, and she made herself not look away because looking away did not change what had happened, and you owed things that happened the respect of seeing them clearly. Coulter rode to her afterward. He did not say anything for a moment. 2, she said. 2, he confirmed. The numbers still work. I know. They rode on. The outlaws came on the 5th day, which was the day she had been most watchful for trouble, and also the day she had been most tired, which she later decided was not a coincidence. Fatigue and threat have an arrangement. They tend to arrive together because one creates the conditions for the other. There were 4 of them. They came out of a narrow side canyon at mid-afternoon, already positioned in a way that had been planned rather than opportunistic, which told her immediately that someone had known the drive's route and timing. She saw them before Coulter did. She had been watching the canyon mouths all morning because the map showed 3 of them along this stretch, and she did not trust canyon mouths on a route that a hostile party might have information about. Left, she said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her slightly. 4 riders, coming out of the second canyon. Coulter turned and saw them. His hand went to his rifle before she had finished the sentence. The 4 riders stopped at a distance that was close enough to be threatening and far enough to have options. They were not wearing anything that identified them. They did not need to. The message was in its positioning. They were between the herd and the next quarter-mile of trail, and there were 4 of them, and they wanted the herd to stop. Walt and Cyrus had already moved. She noticed this with a professional appreciation. The Aldridge brothers had positioned themselves on the flanks before the strangers had fully emerged, which meant they had been watching the same canyon mouths she had been watching. The lead rider held up a hand. Peaceful gesture. Meaningless. Trail's closed ahead, he said. Rock slide. Going to need to reroute south. South takes us through Double Star Land, Coulter said. That's right. Mr. Briggs is willing to allow passage, for a reasonable fee. The word Briggs landed in the group like something dropped from a height. She watched it land in each face. The Vance hands, Peck, Walt, and Cyrus. Watched the arithmetic happen behind each set of eyes. We'll go around, Coulter said. Trail to the east is flooded. It's south or it's back the way you came. Evelyn looked at the canyon mouth behind the 4 riders. She looked at the way they had positioned their horses. Slightly spread, not bunched, the posture of men who expected to hold ground rather than charge. She looked at the terrain to the east, which she had studied on the maps and which was, in fact, not flooded. It had a drainage issue in wet years, but this was not a wet year, and the creek feeding it was running low, the same as everything else in the territory. The eastern trail isn't flooded, she said. Not to the lead rider. To Coulter. Coulter looked at her. I checked the creek levels before we left, she said. The drainage on the eastern trail requires sustained rain. There hasn't been sustained rain in 8 weeks. The lead rider's expression shifted slightly. They're blocking the trail, she said, not reporting one. Coulter turned back to the 4 riders. The change in his posture was not large. It was the kind of change that does not need to be large because the men watching it understood exactly what it meant. We're going east, he said. I wouldn't recommend move your horses or we'll move them. There was a moment that was long enough to matter. She kept her eyes on the lead rider's hands. Behind her, she could hear the herd shifting, the particular collective restlessness of cattle who can feel tension in the humans around them without understanding its source. The 4 riders moved. Not quickly, slowly, with the deliberate pace of men who were making a point about not being afraid, even while they were doing the thing they were told to do. They moved east, away from the trail, and Coulter took the herd north and east simultaneously, angling away from the canyon mouths. And the next 90 minutes were the most focused 90 minutes she had spent since the barn fire. Watching behind, watching the flanks, watching the 4 riders who shadowed them at distance until the terrain shifted and they dropped away. Walt rode up beside her after. Briggs's men, he said. It was not a question. Almost certainly. He knew our route. Someone did. Walt looked at the horizon where the 4 riders had gone. We should have run them off harder. Running them off harder would have spooked the herd, she said, which was probably what they wanted. 4 men against 8 doesn't win a fight on open ground, but it wins if the cattle stampede. Walt was quiet for a moment. You figured that out fast. I'd been thinking about it since we left the ranch. He nodded slowly. Aldridge said you were sharp. I thought he was being polite. He was being accurate, she said, which was the same thing she had said to Coulter about Alma Perez. And she allowed herself the small private satisfaction of saying it again. They made Hartwell on the 8th day, 2 days later than the original plan, but within the window that the buyers had specified. The town was larger than she had expected, a proper commercial hub, with a livestock yard that could process the kind of volume they were bringing. The buyers were waiting and the negotiation was brisk, and she sat in on it at Coulter's left hand and said nothing through most of it. And when the lead buyer made his first offer, she looked at the numbers and then looked at Coulter and gave a slight headshake. Coulter declined. The buyer countered. She gave a slight nod. Coulter accepted. On the ride from the livestock yard to the buyer's office to sign the contract, Coulter said quietly, the headshake. The first offer was 14% below what the premium market rate justifies given their supply shortage, she said. They needed us more than they showed. The nod. The second offer was fair. He was quiet for a moment. I would have taken the first offer. I know. That's why I shook my head. Another quiet moment. Then, so quietly, she almost missed it. Thank you. She looked straight ahead. You're welcome. They signed the contract. The number at the bottom of it was enough to cover the South Barn reconstruction with something left over. Enough to get through the winter with a rebuilt supply inventory. Enough to begin thinking about next year as an expansion rather than a survival. It was not a fortune. It was enough, which was what enough felt like when you had been doing without it for long enough. That evening in Hartwell, in the dining room of the only hotel that was not primarily a saloon, Coulter ordered a bottle of wine that he clearly could not entirely afford and poured 2 glasses and pushed one across the table to her without ceremony. She picked it up. To the drive, he said. To the drive, she said. They drank. The wine was not particularly good. She did not mention this. 229 head, he said. We left with 231. Yes. And we made it. We made it. He looked at the glass in his hand. He had the look of a man who had been holding something tight for a very long time and was in the early stages of deciding whether it was safe to let go. When we get back, he said, there's going to be more. Briggs isn't done. The legal process is slow. He still has allies. I know. Are you... He stopped, started again. You could have left, he said. After the fire. You had enough reason. The marriage was contractual. Your side of it was fulfilled from the day you signed. She looked at him. He was not quite looking at her. He was looking at the table, which was the kind of looking away that was actually about looking toward. The kind you do when you need to say something and direct eye contact would make it impossible. I wasn't going to leave, she said. Why not? She thought about how to answer that honestly. She was not a woman who prettied things up for convenience, and he was not a man who would believe her if she did. Because I had started something, she said, and because by the time I had enough reason to leave, I also had enough reason to stay. Those weren't the same thing at the beginning, but somewhere they became the same thing. He looked up then. He held her gaze with an expression that was unguarded in a way his face rarely was. I don't want you to leave, he said. I know, she said. That's all I wanted to say about it. All right, she said. They finished the wine in the particular comfortable quiet of two people who have stopped performing distance and have not yet decided what to do about that. Outside the hotel, the sounds of Hartwell went about their business. Inside, the lamp on the table burned low and steady, and neither of them moved to turn it up, and that was its own answer to the question neither of them had quite asked. The ride back was 5 days. The herd was gone, sold, and processed, and they rode light, which was a different kind of freedom, faster, more direct, the route that had taken 8 days down taking 5 days back because they were no longer managing the pace of 229 animals. They arrived home on a Wednesday. The ranch had the look of a place that had been held together by the people left behind it. Rosa had managed the house, and the two hands who had stayed to tend the remaining stock had done their work without supervision in the way that people do when they have decided the place matters to them, regardless of who is watching. The Northeast Valley cattle were still in good condition. The supply situation had not deteriorated further. It was not the homecoming of a triumphant return. It was the homecoming of people who had gone somewhere hard and come back with what they had gone for. And the ranch looked exactly as it had when they left, because the world does not rearrange itself to acknowledge your effort. It simply waits and then continues. But Rosa made a meal that was considerably better than the ordinary, and she set the table with the good plates that had belonged to Coulter's mother and had only come out 3 times in the 18 months since Harlan Vance had died. And she did it without being asked and without comment, which was Rosa's way of saying what she thought without saying it. Coulter looked at the table and then at Rosa, and something passed between them that did not need language. That night, after the meal, and after the hands had returned to the bunkhouse, and after Rosa had gone home, Coulter and Evelyn sat on the front porch of the ranch house the way they had never sat before. Not working, not reviewing plans, not building the next case, or calculating the next move. Just sitting. The evening air had that September quality, cooler now, the first real promise that the brutal summer was releasing its grip. She thought about Briggs. She thought about the legal process, and the territorial land office, and the water rights, and the association, and all the pieces still in motion that would require attention tomorrow, and the day after, and the week after that. She thought about all of it, and then she let it sit at the edge of her mind instead of the center of it, which was something she had not been able to do in months. My father asked about you, Coulter said. He meant a letter. Franklin Hale had written twice since the marriage, careful letters that did not know quite what they were apologizing for, but were trying anyway. In the last letter, he asked how you were getting on. What did you tell him? I told him you were getting on better than anyone expected, including me. She watched the dark horizon. He'll worry less hearing that. I also told him the ranch wouldn't have made it through the summer without you, which is true. She was quiet for a moment. That must have been difficult to write, she said. Not as difficult as I would have expected, he said. Turns out honesty gets easier with practice. She almost smiled. The almost smile had been happening more often lately. Above them, the September stars were coming out one by one, the sky going from deep blue to something darker and cleaner, and the crickets that had been silent through the worst of the heat were beginning their noise again, which was its own kind of announcement that the season was turning. Tomorrow, the work would resume. Tomorrow, the legal process and the Briggs situation and the reconstruction and the planning for winter and all of it would require her full attention again. Tomorrow she would open the notebook and the file and start thinking about what came next. But tonight she sat on the porch of a ranch that was hers as much as anyone's now, beside a man who had looked at her across a hotel dining table and said the truest thing he had said to her yet. And she let the evening be what it was without requiring it to be anything else. And that was enough. And it was more than enough. And she was learning, slowly, imperfectly, in the way that people learn things that matter, that those two things could be true at the same time. Part 5. The Territorial Land Office investigator arrived in October, a man named Caswell, with careful eyes and a coat that was too heavy for the weather, as if he had packed for a climate that did not exist in this part of Texas. He spent 3 days at the ranch going through Evelyn's documentation with the methodical patience of a man who had seen enough fabricated grievances to know the difference between one and the real thing. On the third afternoon, he sat across from Evelyn at the kitchen table and looked at the file she had built. The 11 pages of her original documentation, Garrity's signed statement, the trading post records, Carla Benton's water rights research, the combined testimony of 4 ranches, the account of the 5 riders on the drive. And he did not say anything for a long time. "How long did it take you to put this together?" he said finally. "The core documentation, about 2 weeks. Some of the corroborating material came from the other ranches over the following month." "Who helped you?" "The ranchers contributed their own records. Rosa Gutierrez provided the household timeline." She paused. "My husband asked the right questions when I showed him each piece. That helped me see the gaps." Caswell looked at her over the file. "Mrs. Vance, I've done land fraud investigations in 4 territories. In my experience, cases this organized come from one of 2 places. They come from lawyers with research budgets, or they come from people who are extremely angry about something." "I was motivated," she said. "I can see that." He tapped the file. "This is sufficient to open a formal investigation into Double Star's water rights acquisitions and the rustling pattern. The barn fire is a separate matter for the county sheriff, but the documentation here will support that case as well." "How long will the investigation take?" "Months, possibly into next year. Briggs will continue operating during that time." "Yes." "Can the water rights acquisitions be stayed pending the investigation?" Caswell looked at her with something that was almost professional appreciation. "You've been thinking about this." "I've been thinking about very little else. A stay is possible. Not certain. It would require a judge to agree that the acquisitions represent an immediate threat to other operations in the water system. The drought conditions strengthen that argument considerably." He closed the file. "I'll recommend it in my report." He left on the 4th day, taking copies of everything, and in his wake the ranch settled into the particular limbo of waiting for a process larger than yourself to run its course. It was not a comfortable kind of waiting. Evelyn was not built for comfortable waiting. She filled it with work. The south barn went up in October. She managed the reconstruction the way she had managed everything else. Methodically, without waste, with the specific attention to detail that comes from having spent years doing more with less. She sourced the lumber through a contact she had developed during the Hartwell Drive, a supplier in the eastern county who offered better terms than the local yard and whose reliability she had verified through Carla Benton. She hired 3 additional hands for the construction month and retained 2 of them afterward, which brought the ranch crew to a number that could actually manage the operation's scope rather than simply maintaining it at the edge of possible. Coulter watched her move through all of this the way you watch someone who has stopped needing to prove something and started simply doing it. He did not stay out of it. He had opinions about the barn design, about the lumber grade, about which hands were worth retaining. But his opinions were offered as contributions rather than directives. And when she disagreed with him, she said so, and he listened. And about half the time she changed his mind, and about half the time he changed hers, which was roughly the correct proportion. Their marriage, the real one rather than the contractual one, was being built the same way the barn was, plank by plank, without a ceremony, in the ordinary daily accumulation of 2 people making decisions together and discovering that the decisions got better when they were made together than when either of them made them alone. She would not have called it romantic. It was more honest than romantic. It was the particular intimacy of shared difficulty, of having been in a hard place and come through it alongside the same person, of knowing someone's specific gravity under pressure. She knew that Coulter woke at 3 in the morning when something was wrong on the ranch and would not go back to sleep until he had ridden the fence line even in cold weather. She knew that he was harder on himself than on anyone who worked for him. She knew that he carried his father's death in a way he had never processed and probably would not until something forced him to, and she had decided not to force it because that was not the kind of thing that responded well to forcing. He knew that she pushed herself past her physical limits on a regular basis, and considered this a virtue rather than a liability. I knew she kept the notebook at the bedside and sometimes wrote in it at midnight when something in the day's accounting was bothering her. He knew that she missed her brothers and would not say so directly, but sent careful, detailed letters home twice a month without fail. They were learning each other in the slow, inexact way that people learn each other when they start from obligation and arrive at something else. It was not a straight line. There were days when the old distance reasserted itself, when he retreated into the closed-door silence of a man who had spent too many years managing everything alone, or when she pulled back into the self-sufficiency that was her oldest defense against expecting too much from anyone. But those days became fewer, and the distance when it came became shorter, and that was its own kind of evidence. November brought the first serious blow from the legal front. Briggs's lawyers filed a counter-complaint with the Territorial Land Office, arguing that the original documentation had been obtained through improper means. Specifically, that Garrity's statement had been coerced, and that Evelyn's conversations with Peck and Cord Hasley constituted improper inducement of testimony. The counter-complaint was, in Evelyn's assessment, a delay tactic rather than a substantive legal argument. But delay tactics worked because investigations took time and time cost money, and not every operation could sustain the cost of being in legal limbo for months. Caswell sent a letter confirming that the counter-complaint would extend the timeline by at least 60 days. She was reading the letter when Coulter came into the kitchen. She handed it to him without comment. He read it, set it down. 60 days, he said. Minimum. Can we hold for 60 days? Yes. The Hartwell money and the barn reconstruction haven't depleted the reserve past a sustainable point. It's uncomfortable but manageable. She paused. The other ranches are in a different position. He understood immediately. Tom Aldridge's operation was smaller than the Vance Ranch and had been under Briggs's pressure for longer. The legal limbo and the water stay uncertainty were hitting him harder. She knew this because she had been in regular contact with all 4 ranches since the association meeting. Weekly letters, sometimes more. The kind of network maintenance that felt like correspondence but was actually infrastructure. I went to the bank in Harker's Junction last week, she said. Coulter looked at her. Before the letter came, she said, I had been thinking about this possibility. I spoke with the bank manager about the water rights situation and the investigation and the collective position of the ranches in the valley system. He was interested. Interested how? Interested in the concept of a consolidated loan structure. If the 4 ranches formalize their cooperation, not just informally as they have been, but as a documented cooperative agreement with shared liability on certain operational debts, the bank will offer considerably better terms than any single operation could negotiate independently. Coulter very still. It protects Tom's operation through the legal timeline, she said. It also creates the kind of formal structure that makes the water rights case stronger, because a cooperative of 4 ranches with a legal agreement has standing to pursue water access claims that an informal alliance doesn't. You're talking about something permanent, he said. I'm talking about something that outlasts Briggs. Whatever happens in the investigation. He sat down at the table. He looked at the letter, and then at the wall, and then at nothing in particular, which was his thinking posture, the one she had learned to wait through rather than interrupt. Carlo will say yes, he said finally. Jesse, probably. Tom needs it so he doesn't have a choice. But there are other ranches in the valley that aren't part of this yet. Hollis. The Bernardes operation north of the creek system. I know. I was thinking about that. Were you? I thought we might host a meeting here. Let them see the documentation, the bank's preliminary terms, the cooperative structure. Give them the choice to join rather than approach them individually, which makes it look like recruitment. He looked at her across the table. He had a look she recognized, the one that appeared when he was encountering something he had not thought of first and was deciding how to respond to that honestly. When were you thinking? He said. End of November, before the winter makes travel difficult. You've already drafted the cooperative agreement. It was not quite a question. A preliminary version, she said. It needs a lawyer. Evelyn. Yes. How long have you been working on this? Since the Hartwell drive, she said. The outlaws on the trail. When Briggs sent men who knew our route, I understood that individual operations, even well-run ones, even ones with good documentation, are vulnerable to a large enough opponent who's willing to play dirty consistently. The only defense against that over the long term isn't beating him once. It's building something he can't beat. Coulter was quiet for a long moment, outside the window. The November morning was gray and cold, and the ranch yard was empty in the early hour. My father would have hated this idea, he said. I know. He built the ranch as an independent operation. He valued independence above most things. He valued it above his judgment sometimes, Coulter said, which was more than she had ever heard him say about his father's limitations, and she recognized it for what it was. A man reckoning with an inheritance that included both the assets and the errors. The independence doesn't go away, she said carefully. Each ranch still controls its own operations. The cooperative is about shared risk and collective standing, not shared management. He nodded slowly. I'll ride out to see Hollis this week, and the Bernardez family. If they come to the meeting already knowing the basics, the meeting goes better. That's what I thought. He picked up the letter from Caswell again. Read it once more. Set it down. 60 days, he said. 60 days, she confirmed. We've had worse timelines. We have. He looked at her with the expression she had come to think of as the real one, not the public face of the cattle baron, not the guarded look of the man who had signed a contractual marriage at a gate 4 months ago, but the one underneath all of that, the one that was tired and honest and occasionally something closer to grateful. Right, he said. Let's build something. The meeting at the Vance Ranch happened on the 22nd of November. 9 ranches in attendance, 4 who had been part of the association effort, 5 who were new. Carla Benton brought the water rights documentation. Tom Aldridge brought his own records of the losses he had sustained. Jesse Fitch brought the canceled buyer contract. Hollis brought something unexpected, a surveyor's report he had commissioned independently that showed 3 of Briggs's water rights acquisitions had been filed with incorrect boundary descriptions, which meant they might be challengeable on technical grounds alone. The meeting ran for 4 hours. Evelyn presented the cooperative structure herself, with the bank's preliminary terms, which she had formalized in 2 additional meetings with the bank manager over the previous 3 weeks. She had also, in those same weeks, quietly retained a lawyer in Harker's Junction, a woman named Agnes Pruitt, who had a reputation for land law that was somewhat larger than her modest office suggested, and who had reviewed the cooperative agreement and returned it with 17 amendments that made it significantly stronger. Agnes Pruitt was at the meeting. Her presence was its own kind of argument. A lawyer who had reviewed the documents and found them worth defending was a different kind of endorsement than anything Evelyn could have said about her own work. 8 of the 9 ranches signed that day. The 9th, a man named Corrigan, who had been doing business with Briggs on a water lease and was caught between the 2 sides in a way that made every position feel dangerous, asked for 2 weeks to review. He signed 3 weeks later because in that time Caswell's investigation produced its first formal finding. 2 of Briggs's water rights acquisitions in the Valley system were flagged as fraudulently filed. The stay on those acquisitions became permanent pending further review. When Corrigan signed, Evelyn was in the kitchen at the ranch reading Caswell's update letter. She read it twice. Then she set it on the table and sat there for a moment in the quiet of an ordinary Thursday morning. Rosa came in and looked at her face and then at the letter. Good news? Rosa said. The first formal finding, Evelyn said. 2 of Briggs's water rights, fraudulently filed. Rosa sat down at the table. She had been on this ranch for 18 years and had seen it under Harlan Vance, and had watched Coulter inherit it under the worst possible conditions, and had been quietly present through every difficult month since. She did not say anything for a moment. The first day you came, Rosa said, Garrity told the hands you'd be gone by winter. Evelyn looked at her. I didn't think so, Rosa said. I didn't know what I thought exactly, but not that. What did you think? Rosa was quiet for a moment. I thought you had the kind of face that doesn't leave things unfinished, she said. Then she got up and went back to the stove, which was Rosa's way of having said as much as she intended to say. Evelyn looked at the letter again. The full investigation took until March. It was not a clean march toward resolution. There were counters and delays and 2 moments when it looked like Briggs's lawyers would successfully reframe the case in terms that let him keep most of what he had taken. Evelyn responded to both moments the way she responded to difficult terrain on a cattle drive, by finding the path that was actually there rather than the one she wished was there. She worked with Agnes Pruitt on the legal responses. She maintained the cooperative correspondence, keeping all 9 ranches informed and unified through the delays. She made 3 additional trips to the territorial land office in the county seat, twice with Coulter and once alone when Coulter had a health situation. Nothing serious, a fever that passed in 4 days, but 4 days during which she handled every operational and legal matter herself, and told him about it afterward rather than asking permission to handle it, which had become the working arrangement between them. Marcus Briggs settled in March, not because he was legally defeated outright, his lawyers were good enough to prevent that, but because the combination of the cooperative's collective legal standing, Caswell's investigation findings, the fraudulent filing determinations, and the water stay had made his position untenable. The specific term his lawyers used was commercially unviable to continue the dispute, which was the legal way of saying he had run out of room. He gave back the 2 fraudulently acquired water rights. He paid a fine to the territorial land office that was, in Evelyn's private assessment, considerably less than what the damaged operations had cost the other ranches. But Agnes Pruitt had warned her from the beginning that the goal was resolution rather than punishment, and resolution was what they got. He sold the Double Star Ranch 6 months later and left the territory. Evelyn heard about the sale from Carla Benton, who sent a letter that was 4 sentences long and had a quality of satisfaction in it that was entirely justified. The evening she heard, she told Coulter over dinner. He was quiet for a moment. "Gone," he said. "Gone." He looked at his plate. "I don't feel what I expected to feel." "What did you expect?" "More. Something bigger." "It's not a big feeling," she said. "It's just a relief. Like putting down something you've been carrying for so long you forgot it wasn't part of you." He looked at her. "That's what it feels like to me," she said. "I don't know if it's the same for you." "It's the same," he said. They finished dinner. Rosa had gone home. The ranch house was quiet in the particular way it was quiet in the evenings now. Not the strained quiet of 2 people maintaining careful distance, but the easy quiet of a shared space. Later, on the porch, she thought about what Coulter had said, about not feeling what he expected to feel. She understood it because she was feeling the same thing. Not triumph, not vindication exactly, but something quieter and more durable than either. The thing you feel when a long, difficult thing ends, and the ending is correct without being spectacular. She thought about her father's homestead and the wire stretcher in her hands on the morning she was told about the marriage. She thought about signing her name at the gate of the Vance Ranch with a man she had never met, standing 6 feet away looking at her like an inconvenient fact. She thought about the notebook, the Valley Creek, the South Barn burning, the 2 gully crossings and 2 lost steers on the Hartwell Drive, the grain exchange meeting, Carla Benton's voice shutting a room down, Caswell's file, Agnes Pruitt's 17 amendments. She thought about all of it and what it amounted to. What it amounted to was not a story about triumph. That was the thing she had learned, or relearned. She had known pieces of it her whole life, but this year had made the whole picture visible. The things that lasted, the things that actually changed the shape of a place and the lives in it, were not built in moments of victory. They were built in the accumulation of ordinary difficult days where you chose to keep going when stopping would have been easier. She had not been heroic. She had been stubborn and organized and frequently frightened and sometimes wrong. And the difference between her and the people who did not make it through was not that she had been braver or smarter. It was that she had been willing to do the next thing, and the thing after that, without requiring a guarantee that it would work. "What are you thinking about?" Coulter said. He had come out to the porch and was leaning against the rail, looking at the same dark horizon she was. "All of it," she said. "All of what?" "Everything it took to get here." He was quiet for a moment. "It took a lot." "It did." He turned and looked at her. He had aged in the year she had known him. Not badly, not in the way that hard things age people past their time, but in the way that resolution settles into a face, the way a man looks when he has stopped fighting something and started living with it. He looked more like himself, she thought, than he had at the beginning. "I owe you a debt I can't pay back," he said. "You don't owe me anything." "Evelyn, we're partners," she said. "Partners don't owe each other. They build together, and it becomes one thing that belongs to both of them." She paused. "That's what this is." He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "That's what this is." The cooperative had its first formal meeting in April, with all 9 ranches represented and Agnes Pruitt attending as the retained counsel for the group. They were calling it the Valley Cattle Association now, which was a practical name rather than a grand one, and the bank in Harker's Junction had extended the consolidated credit structure on terms that would have been impossible for any single operation to negotiate 6 months earlier. At that meeting, when the chair position came up for discussion, 7 of the 9 ranches nominated Evelyn Vance. She had not expected it. She had been sitting at the table with her copy of the agenda and a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and then Carla Benton said her name, and the vote was called, and she sat very still while 7 hands went up. Coulter's was among them. She looked at him. "You built it," he said, simply. No fanfare. She accepted the chair. She did not make a speech about it. She moved to the next item on the agenda, which was the spring water rotation schedule, because there was work to do, and the work did not wait for sentiment. But she kept the moment. She kept it in the specific way she kept useful things. Not dramatically, not as a story to tell at tables, but quietly, as a reference point. For the harder days that came later, because harder days always came later. For the moments when the thing she was working towards seemed too far away to reach. She would bring out that moment, 7 hands, one of them her husband's, and it would remind her of something not about victory, but about the nature of belonging, about what it meant to have earned a place rather than been given one. That spring, the Northeast Valley Creek ran fuller than it had in 3 years. The rains came finally, carefully, the kind of measured soaking that the territory needed rather than the downpour that would have caused its own damage. The grass on the main grazing sections came back thicker than the previous year. The rebuilt south barn stood solid and smelled of new wood in the mornings. The herd was expanding, carefully, with the discipline that the year's lessons had enforced. No overreach, no more cattle than the land could support, always with one season ahead in the calculations. She had built that discipline into the cooperative structure too, the shared resource planning that prevented individual operations from making decisions that strained the collective water supply. Her father visited in May. He drove up in his wagon with her youngest brother riding alongside, and she watched them come down the ranch road from the front porch and felt something move in her chest that she did not try to name. Franklin Hale was an older man than she remembered. She had been gone less than a year, but the year had contained enough that it felt like several, and in the time compression of that feeling, her father had aged in her mind more than the calendar justified. He was still himself, still the man who had survived bad winters and buried a wife and kept going, but he carried the year's events between them in his posture, the particular weight of a thing a man knows he should not have done and cannot take back. He got down from the wagon and stood in the yard and looked at the ranch and then at her. "You look well," he said. "I am well," she said. He looked around the yard. The new barn, the full corral, the hands going about their business with the ease of people who knew they were working somewhere stable. He took it all in. She could see the calculation happening in his face, the relief, the guilt, the specific complexity of a parent who has put a child in a hard place and watched the child turn it into something the parent could not have imagined. "You're running this place," he said. It came out with a mixture of pride and something more complicated underneath. "I'm running it with Coulter," she said. "That's the correct answer." "But I do my share. He does his. That's how it works." Coulter came out of the barn and shook her father's hand and spoke to him with the specific warmth of a man who has decided to treat someone well, not because the relationship is easy, but because the relationship matters to his wife. Her father was not an easy man to read, but she watched his face during that conversation, and she saw something loosen in it that had been held tight since the morning at the fence line. They stayed 3 days. In the evening, she sat with her youngest brother, who was 17 and had her same tendency toward close observation, and answered his questions about the ranch and the cooperative and the legal process. He listened with the focused attention of someone storing things away for later, and she recognized it because it was what she did and had always done. On the last morning, her father found her at the water trough alone. "I should have told you," he said, "about the contract 3 years ago." "Yes," she said. She did not soften it. "I was afraid," he said. "Afraid you'd refuse. And I was desperate, and I didn't have another way." "I know," she said. "I've known that for a long time." Does it? He stopped. I was a man who was not built for this kind of conversation, who found the words for ordinary things and faltered on the important ones. And she had inherited that tendency along with his brown eyes and his stubbornness and his ability to do hard physical work without complaint. Are you angry? She thought about it honestly. I was, she said, for a while. I'm not now. Because things worked out. Because I understood eventually why you did it. The why doesn't fix it, but it explains it. An explanation isn't the same as excuse, but it's something. He looked at the water trough. He was a man who had spent his life looking at things that needed fixing instead of at the people around him, and she had inherited that too, and she was working on it the same way she worked on everything. You're happy, he said. It came out like a question, even though he was looking at a fact. I'm not miserable, she said. That's where I was aiming. What I got is considerably more than that. He nodded. She could see him absorbing it, filing it in the place where a parent files the evidence that a child has survived the thing that could have broken them. When they left that afternoon, she stood in the ranch yard and watched the wagon until it was smaller than the dust it made. And then she turned back to the work because the afternoon had 3 items that needed handling before dark. That is the thing about a life that has been built rather than given. It does not pause for you to admire it. It asks the next thing of you, and then the next. And the continuity of the asking is itself the measure of what you have made. You know you have built something real when it keeps requiring you, when it grows in the direction of your attention, when the work of maintaining it is not a burden, but simply the rhythm of a day. The Valley Cattle Association grew. By the following year, it had 12 members. By the year after that, 16. The bank in Harker's Junction became a willing partner rather than a cautious one, because the cooperative structure had proven to be exactly what it promised, a collective hedge against the individual vulnerabilities that a single large opponent could exploit. Evelyn chaired every meeting. She was not the loudest voice in the room, and she was not always the most popular one. She made decisions that some members found too conservative and others found too aggressive, and she was wrong often enough to keep her honest about her own limits. But she was consistently the most prepared person at the table, and she was consistently honest about what she did not know. And those two things together turned out to be most of what good leadership actually required. Ranchers who had once dismissed her, men who had stood at the edges of early association meetings with the polite indifference of people attending something they considered beneath their direct attention, sought her opinion on operational decisions. Not because she was the wife of Coulter Vance, though that was how some of them first thought of it, but because the advice she gave was grounded in something real and tended to be right in the ways that mattered. She never confused being sought out with being safe. The territory was large and the interests at stake were significant, and there would always be someone calculating whether a different arrangement would serve them better. She watched for it the way she had watched for canyon mouths on the Hartwell Drive, not with paranoia, but with the steady attention of someone who had learned that threats announce themselves if you are paying the right kind of attention. The notebook was still kept. She was on her 4th one. Coulter expanded the herd incrementally over 3 years, always within the range that the land could support, never overstretching in the way that the frontier's boom years tempted operations to overstretch. He deferred to her on the financial planning, and she deferred to him on the operational management of the herd itself, and they had enough disagreements about the boundary between those domains to keep both of them honest. They had a daughter in the 3rd year. She arrived in February, which was the worst possible month for a ranch, and she announced herself at midnight, which was the worst possible hour. And she was healthy and loud and had Coulter's dark eyes and Evelyn's expression, which was the expression of someone already assessing the situation. Coulter held her with the specific terror of a man who has handled difficult and fragile things all his life and has never handled anything quite this difficult and fragile. She looks like you, he said. She has your eyes. The rest is you. Evelyn looked at her daughter's face. She thought briefly about the fence line at her father's homestead and the wire stretcher in her hands on the morning the arrangement was explained to her. She thought about signing her name at the gate. She thought about the Northeast Valley Creek still running. What do you want to name her? Coulter said. She had thought about this. Clara, she said. After nobody. Just because it's a good name. He nodded. Clara Vance. Clara Vance, she said. Clara was 3 when the cooperative held its 5-year anniversary meeting, at which Evelyn presented a summary of what the organization had achieved. water rights secured for 11 of 16 member operations, collective credit access that had allowed 4 operations to survive drought years they would not otherwise have survived, a legal standing that had successfully defended 3 boundary disputes against outside pressure. The numbers were real, and she presented them without embellishment because they did not need embellishment. At the end of the meeting, Carla Benton, who was 66 now, and had announced she was considering stepping back from active management of her ranch, raised her glass. They had taken to ending the annual meeting with a small toast, a tradition that had grown without being planned, and said, "To the woman who built the table we're all sitting at." Evelyn accepted this without false modesty and without unearned pride. It was accurate, mostly. She had built part of the table. The rest had been built by the people who had shown up and sat at it. She looked around the room at those people. Tom Aldridge, who had come through the worst legal period intact. Jesse Fitch, who had expanded his operation by 30% in the past 2 years. Hollis, who had become one of the cooperative's most reliable voices. New faces she had recruited carefully. Agnes Pruitt in the corner, reviewing something in a folder, still working even at the end of a long meeting, which was why Evelyn trusted her. And Coulter, across the table, who caught her eye and gave a small nod that contained everything the years had built between them and required none of the words. She had come to this territory as a sentence, as a condition in a contract, as the inconvenient solution to someone else's problem. She had arrived in a ranch yard where 2 men leaned against a fence and did not bother to hide what they thought of her, and she had made a decision that morning that she was going to keep making for the rest of her life. She was not going to run. She had not run. What she had built in the not running was not what she had planned, because she had not had a plan beyond surviving the first week, and then the first month, and then the first season. What she had built was larger than plans. It was the kind of thing that gets built sideways, in the spaces between the crises, by someone who is paying attention to what is actually there rather than what they wished was there. The frontier would keep asking hard things of the people who lived on it. That would not change. The droughts and the conflicts and the long legal processes and the neighbors who might or might not be trusted. All of it would continue, because that was the nature of the place and the nature of life in a hard country. What changed was the structure under the people facing those hard things. What changed was that they did not face them alone anymore. That was what she had built. Not a legend, not an empire, a structure. Solid, practical, grounded in the specific reality of what the land required and what the people on it needed. Clara Vance would grow up in that structure. She would take it for granted the way children take for granted the foundations laid before them, which was exactly as it should be. She would face her own hard things, and she would have to find her own answers to them, because that was how it worked. That was the non-negotiable requirement of a life that was actually yours. But she would start from something. She would start from the Valley Creek and the rebuilt barn and the cooperative's 9 original ranches grown to 16 and the notebook on the bedside table and a mother who had arrived in a ranch yard as a sentence and made it into a home. That was enough. That was, in the way that mattered most, everything. The Territorial Land Office investigator arrived on a Tuesday in early October, 3 days after Evelyn and Coulter returned from Hartwell. His name was Caswell. No first name offered, no first name asked, and he traveled with a leather case that was dented at one corner in the way that cases get dented when they have been on too many trips to places that did not have good roads. He was a precise, unhurried man who looked at everything twice before he said anything once, and Evelyn recognized in him the particular patience of someone who had been lied to professionally for long enough that he no longer assumed the first version of anything was the true version. He spent 3 days at the ranch. He read through Evelyn's documentation in the order she presented it, which was the order she had chosen specifically because it built the pattern rather than stating it, letting the evidence arrive before the conclusion so that the conclusion felt like something he had discovered rather than something she was selling him. Caswell was not the kind of man you sold things to. He was the kind of man you showed things to and let him make up his own mind, and she had known that from the first hour and adjusted accordingly. On the 3rd afternoon, he sat across from her at the kitchen table with the full file in front of him and the particular stillness of a man who has finished adding numbers and is looking at the total. "How long did this take you to build?" he said. "The core documentation, about 2 weeks after the fire. The supporting material from the other ranches came in over the following month." He looked at the file. "The signed statement from the foreman." Dutch Garrity. He resigned the morning after Coulter confronted him. The statement was part of the agreement. He wasn't compelled. He was given a choice. He made it without coercion. Caswell turned a page. The water source documentation from Mrs. Benton. Independent of mine, Carla had been building her own file for 8 months before we connected. I've included her original records alongside mine so you can see they came from different directions. He looked at the pages in question. Then he looked at her. In 16 years of land fraud investigation, he said, I have sat across from a great many people who told me they had evidence of wrongdoing. Most of them had grievances, which is a different thing. Some had fragments, pieces of a pattern without the pattern itself. He set his hand on the file. This is the pattern itself. Named, dated, cross-referenced, and corroborated from multiple independent sources. Is it sufficient? She said. It is sufficient to open a formal investigation into the water rights acquisitions. The barn fire is a county matter, but this documentation will support that case as well. I'll recommend a stay on the 2 fraudulently filed acquisitions in my preliminary report. Can the stay be extended to the 3rd acquisition, the one filed under the alderman land agent? Caswell looked at her. The filing dates and the agent name create a connective pattern with the 2 flagged acquisitions, she said. If the first 2 are stayed pending investigation, the 3rd has the same procedural fingerprints and would logically fall under the same review. He was quiet for a moment. I would need to see the alderman filing dates alongside the others. She turned to page 9 of the file and showed him. He read it. He made a note. I'll include it in the recommendation, he said. He left the next morning. After his wagon was out of sight down the ranch road, she stood in the yard for a moment in the October air that was finally, cooler than it had been since May, and let out a breath that had been building for longer than she had realized. Rosa appeared in the kitchen doorway, looked at Evelyn's face, and went back inside without saying anything. 2 minutes later, the smell of coffee came through the door, which was Rosa's vocabulary for the things that did not need words. Coulter came out of the barn. He read her expression the way he had learned to read it over the months. Not perfectly, but accurately enough. He's recommending the stays, she said. He nodded once. He did not make it bigger than it was, which was one of the things she valued about him. He understood that this was a step, not an ending, and that the difference mattered. What comes next? He said. It was not quite a question. The investigation runs its course. Months, Caswell said, possibly into spring. She paused. While it runs, Briggs will work his lawyers. He'll file counter-complaints and challenge the documentation and try to reframe the case in terms that minimize his exposure. His lawyers are good. Agnes Pruitt is better, Coulter said. I think so, but we haven't tested that yet. He looked at the road where Caswell's wagon had gone. You said something before the drive. About building something Briggs can't beat. The cooperative, she said. I've been thinking about it since then, about how to approach the other ranches. I've drafted a preliminary agreement. It needs Agnes Pruitt's review before it goes to anyone. He looked at her with that expression, the one she had catalogued and could now read with some reliability, that appeared when she had been further down a road than he expected. You drafted it when? On the drive, some of it, the rest in the 2 weeks since we got back. Evelyn? I had time in the evenings. He shook his head, not with frustration, but with the specific motion of a man setting down an objection he has decided is not worth making. When do we ride to the other ranches? I thought you might start with Hollis and the Bernardez family. If they come to the meeting already knowing the basics, the meeting produces decisions instead of questions. And you? I have a meeting with Agnes Pruitt in Harker's Junction on Thursday, and another with the bank manager on Friday. He looked at her for a long moment. The October morning was clean and wide around them, the drought's worst weight finally lifting off the land, and the ranch had the quality of a place that had come through something hard and was taking stock of itself. All right, he said, I'll ride out this week. The meeting at the Vance Ranch was set for the 3rd week of November. In the weeks between, Evelyn made 4 trips to Harker's Junction, 2 to Agnes Pruitt's office, where the preliminary cooperative agreement was reviewed, amended, reviewed again, and turned into something that could withstand a legal challenge. 2 to the bank, where the consolidated credit structure was developed into a concrete proposal with actual numbers rather than general terms. The bank manager, a cautious man named Whitfield, who had the look of someone whose natural inclination was always to say no, and who had been saying yes to Evelyn's proposals with increasing frequency and decreasing reluctance, told her on the second visit that in 30 years of banking, he had not seen a ranching cooperative structure this well documented before it had even been presented to its members. "Is that a compliment?" she said. "It's an observation," he said. "The compliment is that we'll extend the preliminary terms." She also maintained the correspondence with the 4 original ranches: Tom Aldridge, Jesse Fitch, Carla Benton, and Hollis, keeping everyone informed and aligned through the waiting period, answering questions by letter when she could not answer them in person, flagging the moments when Briggs's legal team made moves so that no one was surprised. Being surprised, she had learned, was what broke coalitions. People who felt informed stayed steady. People who felt blindsided looked for the nearest exit. The meeting itself ran 4 hours and included 9 ranches total: the 4 originals, Hollis, the Bernardez family, and 3 additional operations that Coulter and Hollis had contacted in the prior weeks. Agnes Pruitt presented the cooperative structure. Carla Benton presented the water rights documentation. Evelyn presented the bank's terms. The room was not immediately enthusiastic. Rooms full of independent ranchers rarely were. There were questions about sovereignty, about whether joining the cooperative meant ceding control of individual decisions, and Evelyn answered each one directly and without overselling. The cooperative controlled collective resources and collective legal standing. Each ranch controlled its own operations, its own herd, its own hiring, its own daily decisions. The shared element was the risk pool and the legal infrastructure, nothing more and nothing less. A man named Corrigan, who ran a modest operation north of Hollis, asked the question that was in several other people's mouths. What happens if Briggs makes us a better offer? If he offers water access in exchange for pulling out of this? The room went quiet. "He'll try," Evelyn said. She said it without heat, as a simple fact. He's probably already thinking about it. The value of this cooperative is precisely that it makes that offer less attractive. Because the collective standing you gain here is worth more to your operation's long-term survival than any short-term water access Briggs can offer. He can also take back what he gives. She paused. The cooperative can't take back what it builds. Corrigan looked at the table. Then he looked at the agreement in front of him. He did not sign that day. He asked for 2 weeks to review. 8 of the 9 ranches signed before the end of the meeting. Corrigan came back 3 weeks later, after Caswell's investigation produced its first formal finding, 2 water rights acquisitions flagged as fraudulently filed, and he signed without further questions. Evelyn added his name to the agreement and sent Agnes Pruitt the updated document and wrote a letter to each of the other 8 ranches informing them. Then she sat in the kitchen with the completed cooperative roster in front of her and thought about what she had set out to build, and what she had actually built, and whether they were the same thing. They were not entirely the same thing. They rarely were. What she had set out to build was a defense. What she had built was something more like an architecture, not just a wall against Briggs, but a structure that had its own reasons for existing beyond the threat that had prompted it. The water rotation planning, the shared credit access, the collective legal standing for any boundary dispute. These things would matter long after Briggs was a resolved chapter. Rosa came in and looked at her face. "Done?" Rosa said. "The first stage?" Evelyn said. Rosa poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down at the table, which she had never done before. She had always stood, always maintained the careful delineation of her role, always been present without presuming. She sat down now and wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at the roster sheet. 18 years I worked for this ranch," she said. "Harlan Vance and then Coulter, and through all the hard years. I stayed because it was good work and because I don't walk away from things." She was quiet for a moment. "But I'll tell you this. The last year has been different from all the others. The last year this ranch felt like it was going somewhere instead of just holding on." Evelyn looked at her. "I wanted to say that," Rosa said. "I don't say things like that usually." "I know you don't. So take it for what it is." "I will," Evelyn said. "Thank you, Rosa." Rosa got up and went back to the stove, and the ordinary moment became ordinary again, which was how those moments worked. And Evelyn sat with her coffee and the roster and thought that being thanked by Rosa Gutierrez was worth more than she could easily explain to anyone who had not spent time in this kitchen. The investigation proceeded through winter and into early spring. It was not a clean progression. Briggs's lawyers filed a countercomplaint in December, arguing that Garrity's statement had been improperly obtained and that Evelyn's conversations with Peck and Cord Hasley constituted inducement of testimony. The countercomplaint added 60 days to the timeline at minimum. Agnes Pruitt responded with a 40-page brief that addressed each point with a specificity that suggested she had anticipated all of them, which she had, because Evelyn had anticipated them first and told Agnes what to expect. There was a hearing in January that Evelyn attended with Agnes Pruitt and Coulter. The hearing room in the county seat was smaller than she had expected and colder, and the judge was a man named Farrow who had the face of someone who had heard a great many people claim a great many things and had developed a strong preference for documentation over testimony. He had a great deal of documentation. He seemed to appreciate this. The countercomplaint was partially sustained on a technicality related to how Peck's account had been recorded. Agnes had warned her about this possibility, and partially dismissed on the substantive grounds that the corroborating evidence from independent sources rendered the challenged testimony non-essential to the case. The stays on the water rights acquisitions remained in place. On the ride back from the county seat, Coulter said, "Partially sustained." "On the procedural point only," Agnes said from the other side of him. "It doesn't touch the core case." "It feels like losing something." "It feels like that," Agnes confirmed. "It isn't." Evelyn rode and said nothing, which was the right thing to do when Agnes Pruitt was making an argument, because interrupting Agnes Pruitt mid-argument was the kind of thing that wasted everyone's time, including your own. "The partial sustain actually helps us," Agnes continued. "It demonstrates to the judge that we're not in this to destroy Briggs on procedural grounds alone. We gave him a small point. The remaining documentation is unaffected and stronger by comparison." Coulter absorbed this. He glanced at Evelyn. "She told you this might happen," he said. It was not a question. "In October," Evelyn said, "when I first showed Agnes the Peck account." He shook his head with the familiar motion. "You should warn me when you've already planned for things. I try not to worry you with things that haven't happened yet." "That's very considerate." "I thought so." Agnes Pruitt, who was 63 and had been married for 31 years to a man who was also a lawyer and who therefore had extensive personal experience with this particular dynamic, looked straight ahead at the road and said nothing. Marcus Briggs settled in March. The settlement came through lawyers, as these things always did, in language that was careful not to admit wrongdoing while doing everything except admit wrongdoing. He returned the 2 fraudulently filed water rights and paid a fine to the Territorial Land Office. A third acquisition, the one filed under the alderman agent, was placed under a permanent review covenant that functionally prevented him from exercising the rights while the review remained open, which Agnes Pruitt had structured to remain open indefinitely under terms that Briggs's lawyers could technically challenge but practically could not resolve in their client's favor. He sold the Double Star Ranch 6 months after the settlement. The buyer was a family from Kansas who had no history with the valley's conflicts and who, in Evelyn's assessment after meeting them briefly at the deed transfer, were straightforward people who intended to run cattle and be left alone. She welcomed them to the cooperative's information meeting, and they attended and asked sensible questions and joined the following year. The day the Double Star sale was finalized, Carla Benton sent a letter. It was 4 sentences. The 4th sentence said, "I believe this is what winning looks like when winning is done right." Evelyn read it twice and then put it in the notebook, folded, between 2 pages of cattle rotation figures, where she would come across it unexpectedly for years afterward. The evening the news came through, she and Coulter sat on the porch, as they had been doing since September, a habit that had grown from the cooling weather and the end of the season's crisis pace into something that belonged to them in a way that was no longer about circumstances, but about preference. The darkness came in from the east the way it always did, and the ranch sounds settled into the night sounds, and neither of them felt the need to make the moment larger than it was. "He's gone," Coulter said. "Yes. I keep waiting to feel something about it." "What do you feel?" He thought about it honestly, which was how he thought about things now. Not quickly, but with the care of a man who had learned that the first answer was not always the true answer. Like a headache that's been there so long I forgot it was a headache and just thought it was the way my head felt. And now it's gone, and I feel the difference, but I can't quite describe the difference except to say it's not there anymore. She understood exactly what he meant. "Yes," she said. "Is that enough?" To just not be there anymore? It's more than enough, she said. It's what we worked for. The work doesn't have to feel triumphant to have been worth doing. He looked at the dark horizon. The stars were sharp and numerous the way they got in October, the sky having decided to be generous with itself. What do you want? He said. It came out differently from the way questions usually came out between them. Not strategic, not planning-oriented, personal. She thought about it. I want what we're already building, she said. I want the cooperative to keep growing in the right direction. I want the ranch to be sustainable for the next generation, not just surviving. I want... She paused. This was harder. I want to know that what we did here outlasts us. Not as a monument, just as something real that keeps being useful after we're not around to maintain it. He was quiet for a moment. We could do that. I think we're doing it, she said. Another quiet moment. The kind that had its own weight now. Not the strained quiet of two people maintaining distance, but the easy quiet of two people who had stopped needing to prove anything to each other. My father put that clause in the contract, Coulter said. The marriage clause. I know. I spent a long time thinking he did it to control me, to extend his management of the ranch past his own death. He paused. I don't think that anymore. What do you think now? I think he knew something about this ranch that I didn't, about what it needed that I couldn't see by myself. He paused again. He knew me well enough to know I wouldn't have gone looking for it. So he made the arrangement, and he put it in a contract, and he made it unavoidable. She sat with that. He never met me, she said. He read your father's character, Coulter said, and he made a judgment. That's a significant thing to stake on a judgment. My father was good at reading people, Coulter said. Better than me. He was quiet. Though I got there eventually. She let the silence run for a moment. Then, you got there when the evidence earned it. Later than it should have. But you got there. He looked at her. The lamp inside the house made a rectangle of warm light through the window, and in that reflected light his face was the face she had been learning for a year and still found new things in. I did, he said. I got there. Their daughter Clara arrived in February of the following year, as mentioned, at midnight in the worst month for a ranch and the worst hour for a human being to do anything requiring full attention. Evelyn was 31 hours in labor, which she would describe afterward as the longest negotiation she had ever conducted. And when it was done, she was exhausted in a way that was different from any exhaustion she had known. Deeper, more total, the kind that went past the body into something below it. Clara had Coulter's eyes and Evelyn's expression and lungs that she deployed with impressive conviction from the first moment, as if she understood that establishing the fact of herself was the first order of business, and she intended to handle it thoroughly. Coulter held her with the specific carefulness of a man encountering something unprecedented. He had managed drought and fire and rustlers and legal battles and a cattle drive through canyon country, and none of it had made his hands unsteady the way they were unsteady now. She's very small, he said. She'll grow, Evelyn said. Her voice came out rough, and she did not care. I know she'll grow. He looked at Clara's face. I wasn't prepared. Nobody's prepared, Evelyn said. You do it anyway. He looked up at her. Something in his eyes that had not been there before, or had been there but had not been visible until now, until something had opened that particular room. I know, he said. I learned that from you. She did not say anything to that. She did not need to. Clara grew. She grew at the rate that children grow when they are well-fed and surrounded by people who are paying attention, which is faster than you expect and in directions you did not anticipate. She was walking by 10 months and running by 13, and by 18 months had developed a confident habit of following Evelyn around the ranch yard in the morning, watching everything with those dark eyes that took things in without immediately outputting conclusions, which was a trait Evelyn recognized because it was how she herself moved through new information. She also had Coulter's stubbornness applied to Evelyn's analytical bent, which produced a combination that was occasionally maddening and consistently interesting. Rosa called her mi pequeña jefa, my little boss, from the time she was 2, because Clara had a habit of positioning herself at the center of whatever activity was happening and observing it with the proprietary attention of a supervisor who had not yet learned to pretend she was not supervising. The cooperative continued to grow. By the end of the second full year, it had 12 member ranches, with 2 more in preliminary discussions. The bank in Harker's Junction had become a genuinely willing partner. Whitfield had been replaced by a younger manager named Dearborn, who had sought out the cooperative's business rather than waiting for it, which was a different kind of relationship with different possibilities. Evelyn chaired every meeting. She was not a perfect chair. She had a tendency to move through agenda items faster than some members could follow, and she had a blind spot for operational detail when she was focused on structural questions, and twice in the first year she had misread the room badly enough that positions she thought were settled turned out to be contested in ways she had not seen coming. Both times she had to go back and rebuild consensus that she had assumed was there. She was wrong with enough regularity to stay honest about her limits. This was, Agnes Pruitt told her once, the most important quality in anyone who ran anything. The people who frighten me, Agnes said, are the ones who don't know when they're wrong. You know. You don't like it, but you know. I don't like it at all, Evelyn said. Good, Agnes said. Keep not liking it. The ranchers who had once dismissed her, who had stood at meeting edges with the polite inattention of people attending something they considered below their primary concern, began seeking her out for operational advice in the years following the cooperative's establishment. She gave it when she had something useful to give and said so directly when she did not, which was a thing people valued even when they would not have predicted they would value it. The territory changed. Not dramatically. Frontier country does not change dramatically. It changes in the slow accumulation of small alterations that you only see clearly in retrospect. But it changed in the direction of something more organized, more collectively managed, less vulnerable to the kind of concentrated power that had allowed Briggs to operate for as long as he had. The cooperative was part of that change. Not the only part, but a part. She would not have said she was responsible for the change. She had started something, and other people had joined it, and the thing they had built together had produced effects none of them could have fully predicted. That was how things that lasted actually worked, not through a single person's will imposed on a resistant world, but through a structure that gave other people's capabilities somewhere useful to go. This was the thing she thought about most, in the years that came after the settlement and the sale and the mourning. Corrigan signed his name at the bottom of the cooperative agreement, and the evening Caswell's formal findings arrived, and all the other moments that she would later identify as the moments when things turned. She thought about it at annual meetings, looking around a room full of people who had built something real together. She thought about it on the porch in the evenings, watching Clara chase the ranch dogs across the yard with an energy that showed no sign of diminishing at any hour. She thought about it when letters arrived from the Territorial Land Office confirming that the water rights structure was holding, when Agnes Pruitt sent the annual review of the cooperative agreement with her amendments, and Evelyn read them and wrote back with her responses, and they argued by letter for a week and arrived somewhere better than either of them had started. She thought about it the morning her father came for his second visit, 2 years after the first, and stood in the ranch yard looking at the south barn that had replaced the one that burned, at the expanded crew, at the corral that held more horses than it had when he first came, at Clara running with the dogs, at Coulter standing at the barn door watching all of it with the expression of a man who had come to terms with his own good fortune without quite being able to believe it. Her father stood beside her and was quiet for a long time. "I keep waiting to feel guilty," he said finally. She looked at him. "About the arrangement, about what I did. I keep thinking I should feel worse about it than I do." He paused. "And then I look at all this and I feel something else instead, and I don't know what to do with it." "You can feel both things," she said. "They're not exclusive." "Is that how you see it?" She thought about honesty. She had a strong preference for it, which did not always make life easier, but which she had found over time made it simpler. "I see it this way," she said. "You put me in a position I didn't choose. That was wrong, and you know it was wrong, and I think you've carried it every day since. But the position turned out to have more in it than either of us knew." She paused. "I don't think you should feel good about what you did. I think you should feel grateful that it didn't go the other way. There are 100 ways it could have gone the other way." He was quiet. "I'm not telling you it was fine," she said. "I'm telling you I'm fine. Those are different things." He looked at her for a long time with the expression of a man receiving information he has been needing for longer than he realized. "Your mother would have liked him," he said, meaning Coulter. "I think so too," she said. He watched Clara run. The dogs were losing the argument badly, which seemed to be exactly the outcome Clara had intended. "She's something," he said. "She is," Evelyn said. "She's going to be difficult and brilliant, and I'm going to spend the next 15 years being 3 steps behind her, and I'm already looking forward to it." Her father laughed. It was the first time in a long time she had heard him laugh without reservation, without the particular care of a man who was not sure he had earned it. Later, on the last evening of his visit, she sat on the porch alone while Coulter put Clara to bed, a process that routinely took 40 minutes longer than planned because Clara had inherited both parents' resistance to the conclusion of a thing once she had decided it was worth her attention. The evening air had the spring quality. It had been building toward for weeks, warm and clean, and carrying the smell of the new grass that had come in thick that year after the winter rains. She thought about what she had said to her father, about position and choice, and the difference between being fine and a thing being fine. She believed it. She had worked hard enough at enough difficult things to know the difference between the story you tell yourself to survive and the truth that emerges when the survival part is over, and you can finally look at it clearly. The truth was this: she would not have chosen the arrangement. She would not choose on her own to be placed in a stranger's ranch against her will, with no guarantee of anything except the contractual obligation she had fulfilled by signing her name. She would not choose the fire, or the drive, or the outlaw riders in the canyon mouth, or the 60 days of legal limbo in winter, or any of the specific hard things that had composed the past 2 years of her life. But she would choose what those things had made. She would choose the cooperative and the notebook and Clara and Rosa and Agnes Pruitt and Carla Benton's 4-sentence letter and Coulter's voice saying, "I do not want you to leave in a hotel dining room in Hartwell over wine that was not particularly good." She would choose all of it. The difficulty and the outcome were not separable. That was the thing you did not know until you were through it. That the hard things were not the price you paid for the good things. They were the material the good things were made of. You could not have one without the other. You could not have the Valley Creek without the turned ankle in the scrub. You could not have the cooperative without the fire that made the vulnerability visible. You could not have the partnership without the contractual starting point that put 2 people in the same house and made them figure out what they were going to do about it. This was not a lesson she had read somewhere. It was a thing she had learned with her hands and her feet on hard ground, in a year that had asked more of her than she had known she had to give, and had gotten it anyway. Coulter came out and sat beside her. Clara had apparently been defeated by sleep, finally, and he had the expression of a man who has negotiated a complicated peace. "She wanted 3 more stories," he said. "How many did you tell?" "2. I held firm on the 3rd. "Was it difficult?" "Extremely." He settled into the chair. "She's going to argue in complete sentences by the time she's 4. "She already argues in complete sentences," Evelyn said. "Complete sentences with subordinate clauses," he said. "I'm not ready." She smiled. Not the almost smile of the early months, but the full one, which she had stopped managing around him sometime in the winter and had not started again. He looked at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I just like seeing that." She looked back at the dark yard and the spring stars coming in, and felt the easy warmth of a moment that did not need to be more than what it was. "I was thinking about something," she said. "Tell me." "About what we've built. And what it's actually for." "Go on." "People build things for a lot of reasons," she said. "To prove something, to protect something, to beat someone who needed beating. All of those were true for us at different points." She paused. "But those reasons run out. The proving stops mattering once you've proved it. The beating is over once the person is gone. If those are the only reasons, the thing you built doesn't have anywhere to go." "And the cooperative," he said. He was following her. "The cooperative started as a defense, but it's not a defense anymore. It's just a better way for people to run ranches in dry country. It has a reason that outlasts the original problem." "Clara will sit at that table someday," he said. "Probably," Evelyn said, "though she'll reorganize the agenda." "Without a doubt." They sat with that. With the daughter asleep inside and the night outside, and the ranch around them that had been a sentence and had become a home, and was now something more than either of those things. The work had done what good work does. It had grown beyond the reasons it was started. In the years that followed, people in the valley would say the Vance Ranch was the backbone of the region's cattle economy. They would say the Valley Cattle Association had changed the way independent operations survived against larger pressures. They would say Evelyn Vance had a mind for structure that came along once in a generation in this kind of country. She would hear all of this and accept it with the particular grace of a woman who knew both what was accurate in it and what it left out. It left out the turned ankles and the wrong estimates and the meetings she had misread and the night she had been frightened and the 2 steers lost on a canyon trail that she still thought about occasionally with the specific sadness of losses that cannot be undone. It left out Peck, who had made a small brave choice and kept his job and became one of the Vance Ranch's most reliable hands. It left out Cord Hasley, who had left after the settlement and whose choice she still thought was complicated. It left out Rosa's Coffee and Agnes Pruitt's 17 amendments, and Carla Benton shutting down a room with 6 words. It left out everything that had actually made it. But that was how the story of a thing tended to go. The version people told was the simplified version, the one with clear causes and visible outcomes, and a protagonist whose qualities explained the result. The real version was messier and more collective and involved a great many more people making a great many more small decisions under difficult conditions, any one of which going differently would have changed everything. She knew the real version. She had written most of it in 4 notebooks. The 4th one was still being written. The night before the cooperative's 5th anniversary meeting, she sat at the kitchen table long after everyone else was asleep and looked at the membership roster, 16 ranches, with 2 more in preliminary discussions, and the financial summary and the water rights map that showed the valley system secured in the way it had not been secured when she arrived. She looked at all of it for a long time. Then she put it in order for the morning presentation, closed the folder, turned down the lamp, and went to bed. Tomorrow, there was work to do. There was always work to do, and the work did not wait for reflection, and the continuity of the work was itself the proof that what she had built was real. She had come to understand this as the most honest measure of a thing, not whether it was celebrated, not whether it was recognized, but whether it kept requiring you, whether it kept growing in the direction of your attention. This did. It had been doing so for 5 years and showed no sign of stopping. She slept well. She had earned it in the oldest way available to a person, by doing, imperfectly and persistently, what the moment asked of her, and by being willing to do it again the next morning, and the morning after that, and every morning that came after the one that had started all of this. A fence line, a wire stretcher, a father with something wrong in his voice, and a woman who had decided, before she knew what she was deciding, that she was not going to run.